Every legend carries something that belongs only to it: emotion, a sound, a force that cannot be separated from the creature that bears it. These are the moves that exist for one reason and one reason alone: to give form to powers that no ordinary creature could hold. Across every region that trainers have walked through, certain Pokemon have stood apart from the rest, not simply because of how strong they were, but because of what they could do that nothing else could. The moves we are going to explore tonight are the signature attacks of the legendary and mythical Pokemon, the techniques written specifically for creatures that exist outside the normal boundaries of the world. And before we drift any further, please consider subscribing to join the Cozy Club for more journey like this, and let me know where in the world you are currently watching from tonight. There is something worth sitting with before we begin. Each of these moves was designed not simply as a tool for battle, but as an expression of what each legendary Pokemon fundamentally is. When you understand why a move behaves the way it does, you understand something deeper about the creature behind it. So tonight we move slowly, one legendary at a time, from the earliest generations to the newest, letting each attack reveal the nature of the Pokemon it belongs to. The story of legendary signature moves in Pokemon does not begin with the very first games. It begins a little later, in the quiet space where designers started to ask what it would mean to give a legendary creature something truly its own. Before that question was fully answered, many of the earliest legendaries simply shared powerful moves with other Pokemon, nothing exclusive to their nature. But with time, each generation brought more attention to the idea of a move that could only exist because of one specific creature. Generation 3 brought us two of the most distinct early examples of this philosophy. The first came from a small steel and psychic type creature that most trainers would recognize by its gentle star-shaped body and the single wish it was said to grant to anyone who caught it. Jirachi had been waiting in a millennium of sleep, and when it finally arrived in the games with a battle-ready move of its own, that move carried the weight of something long delayed. The attack was called Doom Desire, and it suited Jirachi's nature perfectly. Doom Desire is a special steel-type move with a base power of 140 and perfect accuracy. But its defining quality has nothing to do with raw numbers. What makes this move remarkable is its relationship with time. When a trainer commands Jirachi to use Doom Desire, the move is not delivered immediately. Instead, Jirachi sets something in motion, a focused beam of light directed at the target that will strike 2 full turns later. The attack is essentially a promise kept on a delay, and Jirachi, the wishing star, is nothing if not a creature defined by the quiet fulfillment of promises. The strategic implication of this delay is genuinely unusual, because the damage calculation uses Jirachi's special attack stat from the moment the move is first chosen, not from the moment it lands. A trainer can set up Doom Desire and then switch Jirachi out entirely. A defensive Pokemon takes the field for 2 turns, while the concentrated starlight travels toward its target, and then the full force of Jirachi's power arrives without Jirachi needing to be anywhere nearby. The move is a ghost of an intention, a light already sent before the moment of impact. The name itself carries something gentle and strange. Doom is a word that suggests endings, and yet Jirachi is a creature of wishes, of new beginnings. The pairing feels deliberate, a reminder that even the most hopeful dreams sometimes arrive with a force that changes everything around them. There is something almost melancholic about a move that strikes long after the moment of decision, as if the wish was made in a quiet moment and the world simply had to catch up. Not far from Jirachi, in the story of Generation 3 moves, was a creature that felt entirely different in mood and nature. Where Jirachi was soft and patient, Deoxys was alien and precise, a virus from outer space that had been transformed by a laser beam into something that could think and move. Deoxys carried with it an attack that felt like looking directly into a cold and calculating mind. That move was Psycho Boost, a special psychic type attack with a base power of 140 and an accuracy of 90%. On the surface, this sounds purely destructive, and in practice it often is. Psycho Boost can dismantle an opponent's health in a single turn when conditions are right. But there is a cost built into the design that reflects something important about what Deoxys represents. Every time Psycho Boost is used, Deoxys' own special attack drops by 2 stages. The trade off defines a particular style of battle that suited Deoxys' nature precisely. This was a creature built for fast, decisive, overwhelming offense. Its attack form had speed and power that bordered on absurdity. Its normal form was already threatening. Psycho Boost became the ultimate expression of a hit and run approach. Strike with everything, accept the cost, move on. Use it more than twice, and the drop becomes significant enough to change the battle entirely, which means Deoxys was designed to be a creature that commits completely rather than one that settles in for a long fight. This reflects something interesting about how designers were thinking about legendary signature moves even in those early days. A move was not meant to simply be the most powerful option available at every moment. It was meant to tell a story about the creature's nature. Deoxys burning through its own potential with each explosive strike felt exactly right for something that arrived from the void with the cold efficiency of a star falling from the sky. The waters of Generation 4 brought a different kind of legendary, one whose signature move was less about force and more about a subtle shifting of the world's conditions. Manaphy, a small mythical Pokemon, whose body was more water than anything else, arrived with Heart Swap, a psychic-type status move that did something no other move in the game could accomplish. Heart Swap completely exchanged every single stat change between the user and the target. Not one stat, not a selection, every change. If an opponent had spent 3 turns carefully raising their attack, their special attack, and their speed, Manaphy could step in and take all of that preparation and transfer it entirely. The opponent would walk away with whatever Manaphy had accumulated, and Manaphy would carry every boost the opponent had worked to build. In competitive double battles, this created moments of extraordinary drama. A trainer who had spent half the game building up a sweeper could lose all of that investment in 1 turn to a small water creature with round eyes and a blue body. Heart Swap was, in its quiet way, one of the most disrespectful moves in the game. Not loud about it, not dramatic, just a calm exchange that left the opponent with nothing to show for their effort. Years later, in the era of Pokemon Legends, Manaphy received a second signature move called Take Heart. This was a psychic-type status move that healed Manaphy of any status condition it was suffering from, while simultaneously raising both its special attack and special defense. The move felt like a moment of self-renewal, a creature composed of water restoring its own clarity after being clouded. Take Heart also extended to Phione, Manaphy's related lesser mythical, giving both creatures a move that acknowledged their shared nature without confusing their individual identities. Take Heart arrived at a time when both Manaphy and Phione had spent years being treated as minor footnotes in the broader story of legendary Pokemon. Giving them a second exclusive move felt like a quiet recognition that even the smaller legends deserved something genuinely their own. There is a move in the history of Pokemon that was once so feared in competitive play that it had to be significantly changed. That move was Dark Void, and it belonged to a creature called Darkrai, a shadow presence from Sinnoh's mythology that was said to give endless nightmares to anything that wandered near it. Dark Void was a dark-type status move whose purpose was simple and complete. It would put all adjacent opponents to sleep. In a double battle, that meant 2 Pokemon drifting into unconsciousness simultaneously. When the move was introduced in Generation 4, it had an accuracy of 80%, which was high enough that competitive players built entire strategies around it. Getting both opposing Pokemon asleep in 1 turn, while still having 2 active Pokemon of your own, was an almost insurmountable advantage in many situations. The response came in Generation 7, when the accuracy of Dark Void was reduced to 50%, and an additional restriction was added. If any Pokemon other than Darkrai attempted to use the move, it would automatically fail. The second rule was aimed at Smeargle, a Pokemon with a unique ability to copy any move it witnessed and add it to its own repertoire. For years, Smeargle could sketch Dark Void and bring its original power to competitive battles without needing Darkrai at all. The new restriction ended that possibility entirely. The result was a move still tied to a creature of darkness and dreams, but one that had been given reasonable limits. Darkrai's nature is rooted in the idea that sleep is not always peaceful, that the quiet of night can be a place of relentless visions and unease. Dark Void captures that truth without becoming something that warps the entire game around its presence. Some signature moves are memorable because of their visual beauty rather than their competitive power. Seed Flare, which belonged to Shaman in its sky form during Generation 4, was one of those. A special grass type attack with 120 base power and 85% accuracy, Seed Flare was the kind of move that suggested a particular image every time it landed. The secondary effect of Seed Flare was a 40% chance to lower the target's special defense by 2 stages. That is an unusually high probability for a 2-stage drop, and it made Shaman's Skyform genuinely threatening in competitive settings. A single use of Seed Flare could potentially leave the target so exposed that any follow-up attack became disproportionately powerful. The move worked especially well because Shaman's Skyform already had exceptional speed and special attack, meaning it could use Seed Flare and then take advantage of the drop immediately. But the move had an emotional quality beyond its numbers. Shaman was designed around the idea of gratitude and natural healing. Its hedgehog form was gentle and small, and even its sky form, which resembled a white dog with a flower around its neck, had a quality of natural elegance rather than raw aggression. Seed Flare felt like the release of something that had been building quietly, a bloom of energy that had been held inside and then let go with unexpected force. It was a beautiful move, wearing the appearance of a quiet flower suddenly releasing everything it had stored. At the center of all things in Generation 4 stood a creature unlike any other in the entire series. Arceus was the origin, the being said to have shaped the universe itself before resting at the top of Spear Pillar, waiting for a trainer worthy of its attention. The signature move of Arceus was called Judgment, and it was as versatile and absolute as the creature that used it. Judgment was a special normal type move with 100 base power and perfect accuracy. Those numbers are respectable, but not extraordinary, and in isolation, they would not seem to define a creature of cosmic significance. The defining quality of Judgment was something else entirely. Its elemental type changed depending on which plate Arceus happened to be holding. The plates were special items, each one connected to a different type of energy. The flame plate, the splash plate, the meadow plate, and so on through every type in the game. When Arceus held a plate, its body changed type to match, and Judgment became that same type automatically. This meant that Judgment always benefited from the same type attack bonus. Since Arceus and the move were always the same type at the same time, the result was a creature of perfect adaptability. Arceus did not specialize in fire or water or psychic energy. It held all of those possibilities simultaneously and expressed whichever one was called for. Judgment was not merely an attack, it was a statement of complete readiness. Whatever the world required, Arceus could become it. Whatever resistance it faced, it could find the answer within its own nature. This was the philosophical heart of Arceus's design. Not the strongest creature in the traditional sense, but the most complete. Judgment did not overwhelm through raw power. It overwhelmed through precision, through the ability to always be exactly what the moment demanded. Generation 5 brought with it a small mythical creature called Victini that seemed at first glance to be purely about celebration. Its name combined the words victory and tiny. Its body was shaped with round ears like a V for victory, and its entire Pokédex narrative was built around the idea that trainers who encountered it would be blessed with good fortune in battle. But Victini's 2 signature moves were anything but decorative. The first was Searing Shot, a special fire-type move with 100 base power, perfect accuracy, and a 30% chance to inflict a burn on every adjacent target in a double battle. Spread damage with a 30% burn on each target was genuinely powerful, and Searing Shot placed Victini into a role it was not immediately obvious it would fill. The second move was the one that made trainers take notice. V-Create was a physical fire type attack with a base power of 180 and 95% accuracy. Those numbers are not a misprint. 180 is not simply high. It sits at a level of raw power that almost nothing else in the game could match, and the accuracy was high enough that missing was rarely a concern. The cost was significant but manageable, lowering Victini's defense, special defense, and speed by one stage each after use. But the devastation delivered before those drops took effect was often already enough to change the course of a battle entirely. V-Create felt like the visual expression of Victini's personality, a creature so full of energy and potential that it could barely contain itself. The fiery V shape of the attack matched the gesture of victory, and the raw force behind it suggested that Victini, despite its small and cheerful appearance, was carrying something inside it that deserved genuine respect. The Swords of Justice were a group of legendary Pokémon from Generation 5 whose lore drew from a story about ideals and sacrifices made for others. Among them was Keldeo, who occupied a slightly different role, younger and still developing its strength, the apprentice of the group. Keldeo's signature move, Secret Sword, was intimately tied to both its identity and its most important moment of transformation. Secret Sword was a special fighting type move with 85 base power and perfect accuracy, but its most important quality was the way it calculated damage. Despite being a special move that used Keldeo's special attack stat to determine force, it directed that force against the opponent's physical defense rather than their special defense. This made it essentially invisible to Pokemon that had been built specifically to absorb special attacks, such as Blissey and Chansey, creatures with enormous special defense but relatively low physical defense. There was also a narrative dimension to Secret Sword that most moves did not possess. When Keldeo learned this move, something changed in its appearance. The young legendary would transform into what was called its resolute form, its flowing mane becoming longer and more defined, its expression more determined and confident. The move was not simply learned, it was earned, a rite of passage written into the mechanics of the game itself. You could not have Keldeo's resolute form without giving it Secret Sword first. The transformation was conditional on mastery. This made Secret Sword one of the few signature moves in the entire series where learning the attack was itself a meaningful event, rather than simply a number added to a move list. The move and the transformation it triggered were inseparable, which felt true to Keldeo's story as a creature, still becoming what it was always meant to be. Not far from Keldeo, in the tapestry of Generation 5 legendaries, was Meloetta, a mythical Pokemon whose design was entirely built around the idea of performance and transformation. Meloetta existed in two forms, an aria form rooted in grace and melody, and a pirouette form defined by energy and physical movement. Its signature move, Relic Song, was the mechanism through which it switched between them. Relic Song was a special normal type move with 75 base power, perfect accuracy, and a 10% chance to put the target to sleep. Individually, those qualities were fine, but unremarkable. What made Relic Song genuinely interesting was what happened after it landed. Successfully using Relic Song in battle caused Meloetta to immediately transition between its two forms. Aria form had high special attack and special defense, built for sustaining itself through careful special strikes. Pirouette form had high attack and speed, optimized for fast physical aggression. Being able to shift between these two strategic identities mid-battle gave Meloetta a depth of tactical flexibility that was hidden inside an otherwise simple-looking move. An opponent who prepared for one version of Meloetta might find themselves facing the other on the very next turn. The move's name carried something quietly beautiful. A relic is something preserved from a distant past, and a song is something living and changing in the present. Relic songs suggested a melody carried across many generations, a performance given not just once, but again and again through time. Meloetta's entire design was built around music and dance as forms of expression, and having its central move be both a weapon and a shift of identity felt right for a creature whose nature was essentially defined by becoming something different when the music changed. The final legendary signature move from Generation 5 belonged to a creature that felt entirely unlike the others in that generation's roster. Genesect was mechanical, insectoid, ancient, and then rebuilt by a team of scientists who had restored a prehistoric creature and altered it into something more dangerous. Its signature move, Technoblast, carried both parts of that history in its design. Technoblast was originally a special normal type move with 85 base power when it first appeared. In Generation 6, its base power was permanently raised to 120, a buff that acknowledged what the move was always trying to express. Like Judgment before it, Technoblast changed its elemental type, depending on what item Genesect was currently holding. In Genesect's case, the relevant items were called drives, technological devices that could be slotted into the cannon mounted on its back. With the burn drive installed, Technoblast became fire type. The chill drive produced ice type. The douse drive generated water, and the shock drive created electric. Each version of the move also changed the color of the visual cannon on Genesect's back during the animation, a small but precise detail that made the transformation feel more convincing. The cannon was not simply firing different energy, it was visibly configured for each element. The parallel to Judgment was intentional. Genesect was designed by the Plasma Team scientists in Unova as a project that aimed to create something as powerful and versatile as a legendary Pokémon through science rather than nature. Technoblast was a kind of manufactured echo of divine adaptability, a human attempt to replicate what Arceus did naturally. Whether that echo was successful was a question the game left open in an interesting way. Generation 6 arrived in Kalos and brought with it a legendary that looked like pure crystallized elegance. Diancie was a rock and fairy type creature whose design resembled a jewel given movement and life, surrounded by two smaller versions of itself in pink diamond form. The move it carried, Diamond Storm, matched that aesthetic precisely. Diamond Storm was a physical rock type move with 100 base power and 95% accuracy. In double battles, it targeted all adjacent opponents simultaneously, delivering solid spread damage. But the secondary effect was what gave the move its character. After connecting, Diamond Storm carried a 50% chance to raise Diancie's physical defense by 2 stages. A 50% chance on a defense boost after dealing significant spread damage was a substantial package. Diancie could conceivably use Diamond Storm, trigger the boost, and find itself in a position where it was both still dealing damage and becoming harder to break through. The combination turned Diancie from something that appeared primarily decorative into a genuine competitive presence. Beneath the elegance was something surprisingly durable. Diamond Storm also had a visual quality that suited the creature perfectly. The image of a shower of brilliant crystalline projectiles falling on opponents carried the same energy as Diancie's entire design. The sense of beauty that was not fragile, but composed of something fundamentally hard and resistant to being broken. Hoopa was a Generation 6 legendary that existed in 2 forms expressing opposite aspects of its nature, and it possessed a different signature move for each. In its confined form, Hoopa was mischievous and contained, a small ring-tossing presence with a playful quality. In its unbound form, the containment was removed, and something much older and more powerful emerged. The confined form's move was Hyperspace Hole, a special psychic-type attack with 80 base power. The unbound form's move was Hyperspace Fury, a physical dark-type attack with 100 base power that lowered Hoopa's own defense by 1 stage after use. What both moves shared was something more important than their type or power. Neither one could ever miss, and both completely bypassed protective moves, including Protect and Detect. In competitive double battles, moves like Protect are fundamental defensive tools. Being able to ignore them entirely is an extraordinary advantage. An opponent behind a wall of protection was simply not safe from Hoopa's reach. This suited the lore around Hoopa perfectly. Confined Hoopa was described as using rings to pull things through space from distant locations, capable of reaching anywhere it wished, regardless of walls or barriers. Hoopa Unbound extended that idea to its extreme, becoming something that treated the concept of barriers as irrelevant to its intentions. The two signature moves were mechanically different, but thematically identical. Hoopa went where it wanted. Nothing stopped it. The last of Generation 6's legendary exclusive attacks came from Volcanion, a steam and fire creature that occupied an unusual dual typing. Water and fire existed together in Volcanion's body, producing steam as the byproduct of that impossible combination. Its signature move, Steam Eruption, was the natural expression of that internal tension given form. Steam Eruption was a special water-type move with 110 base power and 95% accuracy. The comparison that most naturally came to mind was Scald, the water move famous for its 30% burn chance. Steam Eruption retained that same 30% burn probability while delivering considerably more damage. It also had the additional quality of thawing Volcanion out if it happened to be frozen, which made sense for a creature whose entire body was a furnace. The thaw effect was not merely a practical convenience, it was a piece of expressive design. A Pokemon that generated superheated steam from the interaction of fire and water inside its body should not stay frozen. The move's ability to remove that status reflected Volcanion's fundamental nature rather than simply being a useful added feature. Steam Eruption was also interesting because it framed water as something dangerous rather than simply cleansing. Most water moves suggested flowing rivers or cool rain. Steam under pressure was something else entirely. Something that could strip bark from trees and had temperature enough to cause real damage without producing fire in any visible way. Volcanion's move described a form of water that had been transformed into something far less gentle. The transition into Generation 7 brought a series of legendary signature moves that reflected the Alola region's particular blend of cultural warmth and ancient power. Some of these moves belong to the Ultra Beasts, the guardian deities, and the celestial Pokemon that defined Alola's mythological framework. But one of the most mechanically unusual came from Majerna, a mechanical Pokemon that was simultaneously ancient and modern, described in Pokédex entries as having been built 500 years ago as a gift for a princess. Majerna's signature move was Fleur Cannon, a special fairy-type attack with 130 base power and 90% accuracy. The cost attached to it was familiar from earlier moves in this same tradition. After using Fleur Cannon, Majerna's special attack dropped by 2 stages, a trade-off similar to the one Deoxys accepted with Psycho Boost. But Majerna had a specific ability that changed the calculation around this trade-off significantly. Soul Heart was a passive ability that raised Majerna's special attack by 1 stage every time any Pokemon on the field fainted. In double battles, where feints were more frequent and the drops could be partially offset by Soul Heart triggers, Fleur Cannon became part of a rhythm. Fire the cannon, accept the drop, wait for a Soul Heart activation to begin recovering. The move and the ability were clearly designed together, each making the other more interesting. The visual image of Fleur Cannon was also well chosen for a mechanical creature with a flower-shaped core. The cannon was not a weapon in the traditional sense. It was more like a release, an enormous burst of concentrated soul energy expressed through something that looked like blossoming. The flower at the center of Majerna's body was not decoration. It was the source of everything the creature could do. If Majerna's move was about controlled release, Marshadow's was about something entirely different. Spectral Thief was one of the most aggressively disruptive signature moves in the history of the series, a physical ghost-type attack with 90 base power and perfect accuracy that did something no other move in the game could replicate. Before Spectral Thief dealt any damage at all, Marshadow reached into the target and stole every positive stat change the opponent had accumulated. Attack boosts, speed boosts, special attack increases, defense buffs, all of them were transferred from the target to Marshadow in the moment before impact. Then, the attack landed, and the damage was calculated using the stolen boosts. The implications of this were significant. Against an opponent that had spent multiple turns setting up, Spectral Thief did not simply undo that setup, it reversed it. The target returned to their base stats, while Marshadow carried everything that had been worked for. Every turn the opponent invested in building became a turn that strengthened Marshadow's eventual strike. The move suited Marshadow's visual design and lore precisely. Marshadow was a creature that hid in the shadows of others, an entity that absorbed their emotions and experiences by dwelling in their shade. Spectral Thief was the battle expression of that mythology, a shadow that took what belonged to another and made it its own before striking with the opponent's own power turned against them. The name was accurate in every sense. It was stealing made into a technique. Zurara brought Generation 7's final truly powerful signature move in the form of Plasma Fists, a physical electric-type attack with 100 base power and perfect accuracy. The damage was solid, but the move's most interesting quality was a field effect that existed completely outside the damage itself. For the remainder of the turn, after Plasma Fist was used, every normal-type move attempted by any Pokemon on the field became an electric-type move instead. The duration was brief, only lasting through the rest of that particular turn, but the implications were significant enough to build strategies around. Zurara's passive ability was Vault Absorb, which caused it to restore health instead of taking damage when hit by electric-type moves. In combination with Plasma Fists, this created a window where an opponent's normal-type move could theoretically become free healing for Zurara rather than an attack. The precision required to set this up in a real battle was considerable, but the interaction demonstrated how signature moves were sometimes designed with a creature's entire set of qualities in mind rather than as isolated tools. Zeraora was a creature of pure lightning, described as capable of running at the speed of electricity itself. Plasma Fists expressed that not just through direct damage, but through the ability to briefly reshape the electrical nature of everything happening around it. For one turn, Zeraora could make the entire field resonate with its own element. That felt true to the nature of something that existed as living lightning. Melmetal arrived at the end of Generation 7 with a history unlike any other legendary Pokemon in the series. It was the evolved form of the mythical Meltan, and for a considerable period it could only be obtained through the Pokemon Go mobile game, requiring a trainer to collect enough Meltan candy before the evolution was possible. The journey to acquire it was unusual, which made its signature move feel like a reward earned through genuine effort. That move was Double Iron Bash, a physical steel-type attack that listed 60 base power per hit, but struck twice, making the true combined power 120. The reason the move was printed as 60 per hit, rather than simply 120 total, was the flinch mechanic. Each hit independently had a 30% chance to cause the target to flinch, and since 2 hits occurred, the cumulative probability of landing at least one flinch was meaningful. If the first hit caused a flinch, the second hit still landed because the flinch only prevented the target from acting, not from receiving damage. Melmetal's Iron Fist ability provided an additional boost to all punching moves, and Double Iron Bash was classified as a punching move, which increased its effective power further. The image of Melmetal's enormous hexagonal nut rotating around its arm to build momentum before a double punch expressed something about the mechanical nature of a creature formed from the fusion of countless liquid metal droplets over thousands of years. The move did not look elegant. It looked heavy and definitive. The Rainforest Guardian of Generation 8 was Zarudi, a dark and grass-type legendary whose lore described a solitary and aggressive creature that fiercely protected its territory. Its signature move, Jungle Healing, stood in interesting contrast to that aggressive reputation. It was a grass-type status move with perfect accuracy that restored 25% of maximum health to both Zarude and any allied Pokemon on the field, while completely clearing any status conditions they were suffering from. A healing and cleansing move for a creature described as fierce and reclusive created a useful tension. Zarude was not simply a protector in the offensive sense. Its ability to maintain its allies' health and remove the lingering effects of poison, paralysis, sleep, and burns suggested a more complete form of guardianship, one that sustained as much as it defended. In double battles, jungle healing functioned as an extremely reliable support tool. The combination of healing and status cure in a single move, available every turn with perfect accuracy, gave Zarude a role beyond simple aggression. A team that included Zarude could sustain itself through attrition in ways that teams without access to the move could not. The move's name captured the sense of being restored by something older and deeper than ordinary medicine. Jungle healing was not technological or magical in the way that fairy moves often felt. It was organic, drawing on the ancient vitality of a living forest, which suited a creature that was itself defined by its connection to a particular piece of wilderness. The most recent signature move in the collection at the time of Generation 9's release came from Pekarant, a mythical Pokemon whose small and poisonous nature belied an extraordinary capacity for battlefield control. Its move, Malignant Chain, was a special poison-type attack with 100 base power and perfect accuracy, carrying a 50% chance to apply a badly poisoned status condition to the target. Badly poisoned is distinct from regular poison in a significant way. Regular poison deals a fixed percentage of damage each turn. Badly poisoned damage increases each turn, beginning small but growing rapidly until the poisoned Pokemon is losing a substantial fraction of its health with each passing round. A 50% chance to apply this condition on a move that already dealt solid damage made Malignant Chain a genuinely threatening attack. But the move became something extraordinary when combined with Pesharant's exclusive ability, called Poison Puppeteer. Any Pokemon that was poisoned by one of Pesharant's moves did not simply receive the poison status, it also became confused simultaneously. Confusion caused affected Pokemon to occasionally strike themselves rather than their intended targets, adding an additional layer of unreliability to their actions. The combination of badly poisoned damage accumulation and confusion-induced self-harm created a state of total compromise. The target was taking increasing damage each turn, while also being uncertain whether their own attacks would land where intended. Malignant Chain was less a single strike than an initiation of a controlled collapse, a signature move designed to make anything it touched gradually unable to function. The history of Kanto's legendary signature moves is an unusual one, because the original three legendary birds, Articuno, Zapdos, and Moltres, spent decades in the games without any signature moves of their own. They were powerful and memorable, but the moves they used were shared with other Pokemon. It was not until their Galarian counterparts were introduced in Generation 8 that the birds finally received exclusive attacks. Mewtwo had a different story. The most powerful creature of the original Kanto generation was eventually given a move called Psystrike, introduced retroactively in Generation 5 long after Mewtwo had first appeared. Psystrike was a special psychic-type attack with 100 base power and the unique quality of calculating damage against the target's physical defense rather than their special defense. This distinction made Psystrike extraordinary against a specific type of opponent. Blissey, one of the most common competitive Pokemon used for its enormous health and special defense, was built specifically to absorb special attacks. A Pokemon with high special defense but low physical defense would normally be a natural counter to a special attacker like Mewtwo. Psystrike removed that safety entirely. It used Mewtwo's special attack to generate the attack, borrowed the calculation method of a physical move, and aimed it at the physical defense where Blissey had almost nothing to offer. The result was a move that did not simply make Mewtwo more powerful. It removed one of the most established counterplay strategies against special attacking legendaries. Sistrike suggested something about Mewtwo's nature, that its psychic power was not simply energy of one fixed kind, but something that could reshape how it interacted with the physical world at will. When the Galarian forms of the legendary birds arrived in Generation 8, they finally gave the original trio something they had never possessed. Galarian Articuno received Freezing Glare, a special psychic type attack with 90 base power and a 10% chance to freeze the target. The visual described in its design showed the bird firing psychic energy from both of its eyes simultaneously, the cold so intense and the psychic power so concentrated that physical frost formed from a purely mental force. Galarian Zapdos received Thunderous Kick, a fighting type attack with 90 base power and a guaranteed 100% chance to lower the target's physical defense by one stage. The name suggested electricity, even though the typing was entirely different, which reflected the way Galarian Zapdos itself subverted expectations. Where the original Zapdos was a flying electric bird, the Galarian version was a flightless fighting type that had traded electrical power for raw physical aggression. Galarian Moltres completed the trio with Fiery Wrath, a special dark type move with 90 base power and a 20% chance to make the target flinch. In double battles, it struck both opposing Pokemon at once, making it one of the more threatening spread moves available to the reconceived dark-type bird. The move's nature suited a creature that had transformed the image of fire and passion into something more sinister and volatile. All three Galarian signature moves shared the same base power, which felt like a deliberate design choice to honor the symmetry of the original trio while giving each bird something that expressed its newly transformed nature. Johto's legendary signature moves came from two creatures who sat at the pinnacle of that region's mythology. Lugia, the guardian of the seas, was said to control the weather and could cause 40-day storms simply by spreading its wings carelessly. Its signature attack was Aeroblast, a flying-type move with 100 base power and a high critical hit ratio. In the original Generation 2 games, the animation for Aeroblast was the Hyper Beam animation with adjusted colors and speed, a limitation of the technology available at the time that subsequent generations would eventually correct with more distinct visual effects. But the move itself was immediately recognized as something that suited the Silver Guardian of the water, a concentrated beam of aerial force, something that came not from flame or ice or electricity, but from the pure physics of moving air. Felt consistent with a creature whose primary power was its relationship with the wind. Lugia could hold back the other legendary birds through presence alone according to the game's lore, and Aeroblast was the closest the mechanics could come to expressing what that presence looked like when directed deliberately at an opponent. The high critical hit ratio introduced an element of unpredictability that suited a creature tied to storms. You could prepare for Lugia and still be surprised by the extra force that came from a well-timed strike. The counterpart to Lugia's silver protection was Ho-Oh, the golden bird of the skies, whose feathers were said to bring eternal happiness, and who rewarded those with pure hearts. Where Lugia embodied the controlled force of wind and ocean, Ho-Oh embodied something older and warmer in Sacred Fire, a fire-type attack with 100 base power and a 50% chance to inflict a burn. A 50% burn chance was and remained extraordinary among fire-type attacks. Most fire moves that inflicted burns did so at 10 or 20% probability. Sacred Fire doubled or quintupled those odds, which meant that half the time it connected, the target walked away actively compromised by the lingering heat. In combination with the actual damage of the strike, Sacred Fire was one of the most reliably damaging moves of its generation when the burn landed. Sacred Fire also had a thawing property. If Ho-Oh was frozen when it used the move, the internal heat of the attack would clear the ice before the move delivered its damage. This felt appropriate for a creature described in the lore as a rainbow-colored bird that rose from the ashes of burned towers and carried within itself a fire that could restore life. Entei, one of the three legendary beasts that Ho-Oh was said to have resurrected, would eventually gain access to sacred fire as well, but only starting from Generation 6, several generations after Ho-Oh's original appearance. The sharing of the move between Ho-Oh and Entei acknowledged the lore connection between them while still keeping sacred fire primarily associated with the golden bird above the clouds. Hoenn's legendary signature moves came from a pair of creatures that were among the most recognizable in the series. The Eon pair, Latias and Latios, each had a signature move designed to mirror and complement the other, two sides of a shared identity expressed through different effects. Latias carried Mist Ball, a special psychic type attack with 70 base power and a 50% chance to lower the target's special attack. The move generated a thick cloud of mist around the target, concealing Latias while delivering a strike that could systematically reduce the opponent's ability to mount an effective special offense. The 50% drop rate on special attack was unusually high for a secondary effect, making Mist Ball a surprisingly effective tool for controlling the pace of a battle even at its modest base power. Latios carried Luster Purge, which shared the psychic typing and the 50% secondary effect, but directed its secondary impact differently. Luster Purge had a 50% chance to lower the target's special defense, making it a natural complement to Mist Ball. Where Mist Ball reduced what the opponent could do to Latias, Luster Purge opened the target up to further damage from Latios' own considerable special attack. Luster Purge began with the same 70 base power as its counterpart, but received a substantial improvement in Generation 9, where it was raised to 95 base power. This late generation buff acknowledged that the move had always felt slightly below the power level appropriate for a legendary signature attack. The adjustment brought Luster Purge closer to the impact that a creature with Latios' offensive reputation should have been producing. The visual contrast between the two moves was also thoughtful. Mist was soft and obscuring, suited to Latios' more gentle and protective energy. Luster, pure concentrated light, suited Latios' more direct and brilliant nature. One concealed, one illuminated. Together they described a pair that completed each other. The weather trio that dominated Hoenn's legendary landscape each received signature moves that matched their roles as geological and oceanic forces. Kyogre, the embodiment of the primordial sea, carried Origin Pulse, a special water-type move with 110 base power that struck all opposing Pokémon simultaneously with rings of shimmering blue light. The detail that surprised many fans was that Origin Pulse was not in the original Ruby and Sapphire games where Kyogre first appeared. It arrived 12 years later with the Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire remakes, which meant that Kyogre spent over a decade as one of the most recognized legendary Pokémon in the series without a move that was truly its own. When Origin Pulse finally arrived, it felt like something that had always been meant to exist. Groudon received Precipice Blades, a physical ground-type move with 120 base power that also targeted all opposing Pokémon at once, summoning enormous stone blades rising from beneath the ground. Like Kyogre's equivalent, Precipice Blades arrived with the Generation 6 remakes, rather than being present from Groudon's introduction. The symmetry between the two moves was intentional, both spread moves, both correcting a long absence, both giving the ancient rivals a proper expression of their power. Both moves also raised the question of how a legendary Pokémon defined itself before receiving its signature attack. For 12 years, Kyogre and Groudon had existed as defining pillars of their generation's identity while using moves that were available to many other Pokémon. The arrival of Origin Pulse and Precipice Blades was not simply a mechanical addition, it was a retroactive completion of what those creatures had always been. Rayquaza stood above the rivalry between Kyogre and Groudon as the arbiter of balance between sky and earth. Its signature move, Dragon Ascent, was a flying-type attack with 120 base power that lowered the user's defense and special defense after use. The numbers were solid, but not remarkable, and the defense drops were a cost worth considering. What made Dragon Ascent unlike any other move in the history of the series was a single additional property. Dragon Ascent was the only move in Pokemon history capable of triggering a Mega Evolution. Not through a Mega Stone, which was the mechanism every other Mega Evolving Pokemon used. Rayquaza's Mega Evolution required no stone at all. It required only that Rayquaza know Dragon Ascent. The move was the key to the transformation. As long as the attack was in Rayquaza's move list, the Mega Evolution was available. The lore justification for this was written into the game itself. Rayquaza's body was described as being capable of absorbing meteorite particles from the atmosphere as it flew through the stratosphere, converting that cosmic material into energy that could power the same kind of transformation that a megastone would normally provide. The move symbolized ascending high enough to gather that energy. And the transformation that followed was the release of everything gathered. The name Dragon Ascent was also worth noting. Despite every expectation that a move with that name would be dragon-typed, it was in fact flying-type. The name described the action, rising through the atmosphere at speed, which was exactly what the move's animation showed. The type described the energy. Sinnoh brought a legendary lineup that was among the most philosophically dense in the series, creatures whose very existence described the fundamental structure of the universe. The Lake Guardians, Uxie, Mesprit, and Azelf, spent 4 entire generations without any exclusive attack before finally receiving a shared signature move called Mystical Power in Pokemon Legends Arceus. Mystical Power was a special psychic type attack with 70 base power that raised the user's own attacking stat by 1 stage after connecting. For a shared move among 3 very different creatures, this design choice was elegant. Uxie relied on its defenses and preferred evasive strategies. Mesprit balanced its stats evenly. Azelf favored raw attack. Mystical Power's stat boost, adapting to whichever stat happened to be the user's primary attacking stat, made it function differently in practice for each of the 3, even though mechanically it was the same move. The move also incorporated a visual quality that suited the Lake Guardian's nature, an enveloping cosmic aura before the strike that suggested something older and more profound than simple energy release. These were creatures described as the bearers of willpower, emotion, and knowledge, the 3 foundations of living beings. A move wrapped in mysterious light felt appropriate for entities of that nature. The 4 generations they spent without a signature move was itself notable. Not every legendary needed exclusivity from the beginning. Sometimes the wait produced something that felt more meaningful precisely because it arrived later. Dialga, the temporal dragon of Sinnoh, was defined by its absolute command over time. Its signature move, Roar of Time, expressed that power without reservation. A dragon-type attack with 150 base power and perfect accuracy, Roar of Time hit with a force that was genuinely difficult to survive without extraordinary defensive preparation. The cost was that Dialga needed an entire turn to recharge afterward, unable to act while the reverberations of its temporal strike settled. In many ways, Roar of Time was a high-powered recharge move, similar in structure to Hyper Beam. But the dragon typing, the lore, and the context all gave it a weight that the generic version lacked. Dialga was not simply firing a large amount of energy, it was bending the flow of time itself into a physical expression of force. The recharge turn was not simply weakness, it was Dialga waiting for time to resume its normal direction after temporarily redirecting it. Palkia, the spatial dragon whose role was to maintain and create the fabric of space, had Spatial Rend, a dragon-type attack with 100 base power and a high critical hit ratio. Where Roar of Time required a recovery turn, Spatial Rend had no such limitation. It also carried the interesting quality of tearing space itself to reach its target, an effect that mechanically translated as a reliable high critical rate rather than any bypass of defensive moves. The contrast between the 2 moves was thematically exact. Time flowed in one direction and had to be corrected after being disrupted. Space could be torn, and then closed without requiring recovery. Dialga paid for its power with time. Palkia paid for nothing, because nothing was required when you could simply move through the space between forces. Heatran was a legendary, defined by the idea of a creature born in volcanic rock and fire, something that lived at the boundary between the Earth's surface and its burning interior. Its signature move, Magma Storm, expressed that origin through trapping rather than through simple damage. Magma Storm was a fire-type attack with 100 base power that enclosed the target in a swirling vortex of molten material for 4 to 5 turns. While trapped in the storm, the target received continuous chip damage each turn and was completely unable to switch out of battle. The accuracy was not perfect, which reflected the unpredictable nature of a volcanic eruption, but when it connected it, changed the dynamics of a battle in ways that precise damage calculation alone could not. A Pokemon that could not switch out was a Pokemon denied its most powerful defensive option. In competitive play, the ability to switch was fundamental to maintaining favorable matchups. Magma Storm removed that option for several turns, while also steadily reducing the trapped Pokemon's health. The trap moved in the traditions of moves like Fire Spin, but at a scale and temperature that felt proportional to the creature using it. The lore described Magma Storm's temperature as capable of dissolving solid bedrock in moments, which gave the move an intensity that matched what Heatran itself represented. A creature that lived comfortably in temperatures capable of melting stone produced fire that was not simply hot, but geologically transformative. Regigigas was the ancient colossus at the center of the Regi group's mythology, a legendary described as having dragged the continents into their current positions through raw physical strength during a prehistoric age. Its signature move, Crush Grip, attempted to express that prehistoric power through a variable damage formula tied to the target's remaining health. Crush Grip could reach a maximum base power of 121 when the target was at full health, dealing more damage the more HP the target retained. The concept was physically intuitive. The more substance an object had, the more force could be applied to crush it effectively. At full health, an opponent had maximum mass for Regigigas to work against. The move's practical impact was complicated by Regigigas' passive ability, Slow Start. For the first 5 turns of any battle, Slow Start halved both Regigigas' attack and speed. During those 5 turns, Crush Grip dealt far less than its theoretical maximum, regardless of the target's health. By the time Slow Start ended, and Crush Grip could operate at full strength, battle conditions had usually changed significantly. The relationship between Crush Grip's enormous potential and Slow Start's systematic limitation created one of the more interesting design tensions in Legendary Pokémon. The creature with the most physical history in the lore was mechanically one of the most constrained in practice. The power was real. Accessing it consistently was the difficulty. Giratina's presence in the Pokemon universe was defined by its exile to the Distortion world, a realm that existed alongside the ordinary one, but inverted its properties. Shadow Force, Giratina's signature move, was a direct expression of that relationship with an alternate dimension. Shadow Force was a ghost-type physical attack with 120 base power. It operated over 2 turns. On the first turn, Giratina vanished completely from the field, slipping into what the lore implied was the Distortion world. On the second turn, it returned and delivered the strike with full force. Unlike similar 2-turn moves, Shadow Force specifically bypassed Protect and Detect entirely. A Pokemon that attempted to hide behind protection during Giratina's absent turn would find the defense meaningless when the attack arrived. The mechanic was thematically precise. Giratina's entire identity was built around existing in a space that ordinary rules did not govern. A creature from outside the normal order of things, moving through a dimension that was outside the normal order of things, and returning to strike from a direction that protective moves could not anticipate, felt like the correct expression of what Giratina was. The base power was also significant. 120 was enough to be a genuine threat without being excessive for a move that already had the advantage of bypassing protection. Giratina did not need to overwhelm through raw numbers. It simply needed to be somewhere that defensive measures could not reach. Cresselia was the counterpart to Darkrai, the moon-born guardian whose crescent-shaped wings produced light that could banish the nightmares Darkrai sent. It was appropriate then that Cresselia possessed not one but two signature moves, both of them defined by a quality of self-sacrifice and sustaining rather than aggression. Lunar Dance was the first, and it was unlike almost any other move in the game. When Cresselia used Lunar Dance, it fainted immediately and completely willingly. No damage was dealt to the opponent. The purpose was entirely to restore the Pokémon that came in to replace it. The replacement entered with full health, full PP for all its moves, and completely clear of any status conditions. This was the ultimate support play. A creature surrendering its own continued participation in the battle to ensure that its ally would be able to operate at absolute peak capacity. In late game scenarios where a Pokemon with a crucial role had been weakened or poisoned, Lunar Dance could completely reset the conditions of the battle. The Pokemon that stepped in after Cresselia's sacrifice arrived as though the battle had just begun for them. Lunar Blessing was the second signature move, added to Cresselia's capabilities in Pokemon Legends. This one was less dramatic and more sustainable. Lunar Blessing healed both Cresselia and its ally by 25% of their maximum health and cleared any active status conditions from both. Unlike Lunar Dance, it could be used repeatedly without ending Cresselia's participation in the battle, making it a reliable ongoing support option for a creature whose role was to sustain rather than destroy. The Swords of Justice were a quartet of legendary Pokemon whose shared lore described them as fighters who made sacrifices to protect weaker Pokemon from human conflict. Sacred Sword was the attack that initially belonged to all four of them, a physical fighting type move with 90 base power. What distinguished Sacred Sword from ordinary fighting type moves was its complete disregard for the opponent's defensive preparation. The move ignored any stat changes the target had applied to their defense or evasion. No matter how many times an opponent had used Iron Defense to harden themselves, no matter how much evasion they had stacked, Sacred Sword cut through all of it. The calculation was performed against their base stats, as though the boosts had never happened. This quality made Sacred Sword especially effective against defensive strategies that relied on stat accumulation rather than raw numbers. A Pokemon that had built itself into an enormous wall through multiple turns of preparation could still be damaged cleanly through Sacred Sword, as though all that preparation had occurred in an entirely different battle. Over time, Sacred Sword became available to additional Pokemon outside the original Legendary Quartet, as Aegislash and other blade-wielding Pokemon were added to the series. This diluted its exclusive nature somewhat, though the move remained closely associated with the Swords of Justice and the popular imagination. The forces that governed Unova's weather systems were represented by three legendary Pokemon called the Genies: Tornadus, Thundurus, and Landorus. Each controlled a different atmospheric phenomenon, and each received a signature move in Pokemon Legends that matched their elemental domain while sharing a common structure. Tornadus received Bleakwind Storm, a flying type attack with 100 base power and a 30% chance to drop the target speed. Like all three Genie signature moves, Bleakwind Storm had 95% accuracy normally, but became perfectly accurate when rain was active on the field, acknowledging that a creature of wind and storm operated most effectively in the conditions it helped create. Thundurus received Wild Bolt Storm, an electric type attack also, with 100 base power, carrying a 20% chance to paralyze the target. The same accuracy bonus in rain applied, and the interaction between an electric type move becoming perfectly accurate during rainfall created an interesting relationship with weather conditions that Thundurus itself could summon through its drizzle or other weather abilities in certain configurations. Landorus received Sandsear Storm, a ground-type attack with the same 100 base power and a 20% chance to apply a burn. Landorus had long been considered among the most competitively significant Pokémon in the series even before receiving a dedicated signature move, with its Therian form appearing in competitive team building across multiple generations. Giving it a spread damage move that threatened burns only extended the list of reasons Landorus demanded respect from any opposing team. Reshiram and Zekrom stood at the ideological center of Unova's legendary narrative, embodying truth and ideals respectively, and a story about what it meant to pursue one versus the other. Their signature moves came in pairs, each dragon holding two attacks that worked in relationship with the other. Reshiram carried Fusion Flare and Blue Flare. Fusion Flare was a special fire-type move with 100 base power. Blue Flare was a special fire-type move with 130 base power and a 20% chance to burn. These were already excellent moves in isolation, but Fusion Flare had a specific interaction with Zekrom's complementary attack. If Fusion Flare was used immediately after Zekrom used Fusion Bolt, the power of Fusion Flare doubled to 200. The reverse was also true. The two moves were designed to reward a strategy where both dragons participated in the same battle, which was unusual but referenced the lore about the two legendaries being halves of a single original dragon that had separated. In battle, their greatest power came from acting together. Blue Flare's visual identity also carried a scientific note that the game incorporated into the Pokédex descriptions. The blue coloration of Reshiram's flame was not arbitrary. Blue flames scientifically represent the hottest part of a fire, a temperature at which combustion is occurring most efficiently. Reshiram's white and blue aesthetic was built around the image of perfect burning, which made Blue Flare more than just a strong attack. It was a statement about what Reshiram's fire fundamentally was. Zekrom held Fusion Bolt and Bolt Strike as its counterparts. Fusion Bolt at 100 base power, and Bolt Strike at 130, with Bolt Strike enveloping Zekrom entirely in a sphere of electrical discharge before it impacted. The visual of Zekrom becoming a living meteor of lightning for the duration of Bolt Strike was one of the more striking attack animations of that generation. Between the absolute truth of Reshiram and the pure ideals of Zekrom existed Kyurem, described as the empty shell of the original dragon, a creature without truth or ideals, waiting for what it had lost to return to it. Kyurem possessed 3 signature moves in total, each corresponding to a different state of its existence. Glaciate was the base form's signature, a special ice-type move with 65 base power that hit both opposing Pokémon simultaneously with a 100% chance to lower their speed by 1 stage. The guaranteed speed reduction was a significant utility effect, even if the damage was modest. Against a faster opponent, Glaciate could reverse speed priority entirely in 1 use. When Kyurem fused with Zekrom to become Black Kyurem, it gained Freeze Shock, a physical ice-type move with 140 base power and a 30% chance to paralyze. Freeze Shock was a 2-turn move, charging on the first turn and striking on the second. It was also one of the rarest moves in the franchise for combining the visual properties of ice and electricity. The charge animation resembling static buildup before the cold struck. White Kyurem's fusion with Reshiram produced Ice Burn, a special ice-type move with 140 base power and a 30% chance to burn. Ice Burn shared Freeze Shock's 2-turn charging structure. The concept of ice producing a burn was built on the scientific reality of extreme frostbite, which damages living tissue through cellular destruction in a manner that closely resembles the physical effects of severe fire burns. The move's name made that scientific observation explicit in game for anyone curious enough to wonder how freezing could produce burning. Generation 6 brought Xerneas and Yveltal, the life and death forces of Kalos, each with a signature move that expressed their cosmological role without ambiguity. Xerneas, the giver of life, carried Geomancy. Yveltal, the absorber of life, carried Oblivion Wing. Geomancy was a two-turn special status move that sharply raised Xerneas' special attack, special defense, and speed by 2 stages each, 3 stats simultaneously by 2 stages each, in a single activation. The cost was the two-turn charging requirement, which created a window of vulnerability. Competitive players almost universally responded to this by equipping Xerneas with a Power Herb, a held item that caused two-turn charging moves to activate immediately in exchange for consuming the item. The combination made Geomancy an immediate triple boost with no turn of vulnerability. During the charging animation, Xerneas' distinctive horns would glow in 7 different colors, a visual detail drawn directly from the Pokédex's description of Xerneas sharing eternal life by shining those same luminous colors. The move was not just a stat boost in the competitive sense. It was Xerneas gathering the life energy of the surrounding world into itself before releasing it as transformed power. Oblivion Wing expressed Yveltal's nature through the opposite lens. An 80 base power flying type attack, Oblivion Wing restored the user's health by 75% of the damage dealt. 3/4 of every bit of damage done returned to Yveltal as renewed vitality. This was a more generous ratio than even traditional absorbing moves. The implication from the lore was that when Yveltal's life came to its end, it would spread its wings and absorb the life energy of every creature within range before entering a cocoon of sleep. Oblivion Wing was that power expressed on a smaller scale. The gentle continuous drawing in of life that Yveltal was said to perform at the end of its existence. Zygarde occupied a unique position among Generation 6 legendaries as a creature with 5 different signature moves, the most of any Pokemon in the series. Its completions forms, from 10% to 50% to 100%, each had access to different combinations of these moves, and some were hidden in game code for years before finally becoming available. Land's Wrath was the first, a physical ground type attack with 90 base power that hit both opposing Pokemon in a double battle. It was the only one of Zygarde's 5 signature moves that was accessible to players in the original Pokemon X and Y, and even then, only because those games contained the other 4 in dormant, inaccessible form. Thousand Arrows shared the 90 base power and double target effect, but distinguished itself through an extraordinary exception to normal game rules. Ground-type moves could not normally hit flying-type Pokemon or those affected by the Levitate ability. Thousand Arrows bypassed this immunity entirely, pulling any airborne target down to the ground level and applying the full damage. Once affected by Thousand Arrows, a flying-type Pokemon lost its ground immunity for the remainder of the battle, permanently grounded for purposes of future moves. Thousand Waves carried the same 90 base power and double target property, but added a trapping effect. Any Pokemon struck by Thousand Waves was unable to switch out for the duration of the battle. The tremor created by the move sealed the escape route. Core Enforcer was the fourth, a dragon-type beam with 100 base power that suppressed the target's ability entirely if that Pokemon had already taken an action that turn. The animation carved a glowing Z shape into the ground, a direct reference to Zygarde's role as the intended mascot of an unreleased Pokemon Z game that eventually became Pokemon Legends ZA. The fifth move, Nihil Light, arrived in Pokemon Legends for Z-Guard Complete Form. Described as an amplification of Core Enforcer's concept into something of apocalyptic scale, Nihil Light expressed what Z-Guard's complete form could do when all of its cells were gathered and its full nature was finally expressed. Silvally was a creature artificially created by the Aether Foundation in Alola, a project designed to build something that could rival Pokemon of legendary power for the purpose of fighting Ultra Beasts. Its signature move, Multi-Attack, carried both the ambition of that project and its inherent imitation. Multi-Attack was a physical move with 120 base power whose elemental type changed depending on which memory item Silvally was currently holding. Different memories encoded different types, and Silvally could change its type and the type of multi-attack accordingly. The parallels to Arceus's judgment were explicit in the game's own lore. Multi-attack was described as a move that had been engineered specifically to mimic judgment, an attempt to replicate divine adaptability through scientific means. The nature deities of Alola, the four guardian Pokemon Tapu Koko, Tapu Lele, Tapu Bulu, and Tapu Fini, shared a signature move called Nature's Madness. Rather than dealing damage through raw power, Nature's Madness cut the target's current health directly in half, not a percentage of maximum health, a percentage of remaining health at the moment of impact. This meant Nature's Madness was useful regardless of how damaged a target was, always relevant as long as they still had health to remove. But it also meant the move could never by itself reduce a target to zero. Halving repeatedly approached zero, but never reached it, making Nature's Madness a tool for softening rather than finishing. With their exclusive Z crystals, the move transformed into an enormous glowing avatar that crushed the opponent with the full presence of the corresponding deity. Solgaleo was the stellar creature of Alola, a lion described in Pokédex entries as the emissary of the sun, a being that devoured light in the process of moving through the universe. Its signature move, Sunsteel Strike, was a physical steel-type attack with 100 base power that carried a property unique among physical attacks. Sunsteel Strike completely ignored the target's ability when dealing damage. Abilities like Fur Coat, which doubled physical defense, or Marvel Scale, which raised defense under certain conditions, or the standard ability of Multiscale, which halved damage taken at full health, all of them were bypassed. The attack connected as though the target's ability simply did not exist for purposes of that interaction. The Pokédex's description of the strike stated that it shone so brilliantly that even the darkest night would appear as day when the move connected. An attack luminous enough to turn night into day expressed something about what a creature made of stellar material was capable of. The steel typing grounded it in the physical, but the lore gave it something more. Lunala, the moon creature that served as Solgaleo's counterpart, had Moongeist Beam, which carried the same 100 base power and the same ability ignoring property. Where Sunsteel Strike projected light that turned night to day, Moongeist Beam absorbed all surrounding light to produce a beam of spectral darkness that turned a bright day into the dead of night. The two moves were exact opposites in their visual and elemental expression, while being mechanically identical in their ability bypassing property. In competitive play, the ability to ignore multiscale and Mimikyu's disguise ability made both moves valuable against opponents who relied on those abilities to absorb the first hit safely. Moongeist Beam in particular became a frequently mentioned counter to Mimikyu, because the disguise that normally absorbed the first hit regardless of damage was simply not consulted during Moongeist Beam's calculation. Necrozma began as a lesser presence in Alola's story, but gradually revealed itself to be a creature of ancient cosmic importance, a being that had once illuminated an entire world with its light before being shattered and diminished. It carried two signature moves, each expressing a different dimension of its nature. Prismatic Laser was a special psychic-type attack with 160 base power that required a recharge turn after use, excluding max moves and Z moves, which operated through different mechanics. Prismatic Laser held the highest base power of any psychic-type move in the entire franchise at the time of its introduction. The cost of the recharge turn was significant, but proportional to the damage delivered. Photon Geyser was the more tactically interesting of the two, a psychic-type attack with 100 base power, whose defining quality was a real-time comparison of Necrozma's current attack and special attack stats. The move always used whichever stat was higher at the moment of use, automatically adjusting between physical and special damage calculation. This made Necrozma effectively a dual attacker, capable of operating in either role depending on how its stats had been altered during the battle. Competitive players recognized immediately that Photon Geyser's flexibility made Necrozma dangerous to prepare for. An opponent who had raised their physical defense against a physical Necrozma might find the move suddenly using special attack. An opponent who had raised their special defense might see the opposite calculation. Photon Geyser denied the comfort of assuming which dimension of Necrozma's power you were preparing to face. The Galar region brought a new pair of rivals, in the form of Zacian and Zamazenta, the wolf legendaries whose lore positioned them as the heroes who had protected Galar from ruin in the distant past. In their crowned forms, each carrying either a sword or a shield in addition to their natural armor, they received signature moves that matched their roles with precision. Zacian's crowned sword form used Behemoth Blade, a physical steel-type move with 100 base power. In most battles, this was a respectable strike, but not exceptional. The move's truly distinctive quality emerged against Dynamaxed opponents. When the target had used Dynamax or Gigantamax, Behemoth Blade's power doubled to 200. Against the towering giants that Dynamax produced, Zacian's blade grew to match the scale of what it faced. Zamazenta's crown shield form used Behemoth Bash, a physical steel-type move with identical numbers and the identical Dynamax doubling property. Where Zacian's move described a blade growing to match the enemy, Zamazenta's described a shield expanding into a fortress. The lore stated that no attack in the known world could pierce Zamazenta's shield during the charge. The defensive creature was not simply blocking. It was using the absolute solidity of its shield as the weapon. Both moves also fit the Galar region's relationship with Dynamax as a phenomenon. The Crown Tundra DLC, where these forms were obtained, framed Zacian and Zamazenta as creatures specifically equipped to counter the out-of-control Dynamax energy that threatened the region. Their signature move's bonus against Dynamax targets was a direct, mechanical expression of that role. Eternatus was the cosmic parasite that had arrived in Galar on a meteorite 50,000 years ago, described in the lore as the origin of the Dynamax phenomenon. Its energy had been leaking into Galar's atmosphere ever since its arrival, creating the unusual concentrations of Galar particles that allowed Pokémon to grow to enormous size in the region's power spots. Its first signature move, Dynamax Cannon, was a special dragon-type attack with 100 base power. Like Behemoth Blade and Behemoth Bash, Dynamax Cannon doubled its power against Dynamax targets, making it effectively 200 base power under those conditions. The move was described as firing a concentrated beam that specifically destabilized the Galar particles inside giant Pokémon, a targeted counter to the very phenomenon Eternatus itself had created. Eternabeam was the second, a special dragon-type move with 160 base power that required a recharge turn after use. During the animation, Eternatus briefly forced itself into its Eternamax form, the boss-only configuration with statistics so extreme that it was never made available to players in standard gameplay. The attack was the only moment in ordinary battle where that true form was visible, a glimpse of what Eternatus actually was when it was not constrained. Both moves together described a creature that had been causing damage simply by existing for 50,000 years, and had now focused that accumulated energy into something directed and deliberate. Eternatus did not attack out of malice in the traditional sense. It expressed the energy that had always been present in its body, whether that expression was benign or catastrophic. The Isle of Armor brought two versions of Urshifu, a legendary Pokémon that had trained in a fighting style focused either on absolute singular force or on flowing multiple strikes. The contrast between the two styles was expressed perfectly in their signature moves. Single strike style Urshifu used Wicked Blow, a physical dark-type move with 75 base power. The number appeared modest until the full property was understood. Wicked Blow was a guaranteed critical hit, every single time, without exception. Critical hits in Pokémon deal 1.5 times normal damage, and more importantly, they ignore negative stat changes applied to the attacker's attack or the defender's defense. An attack stat reduced by Intimidate or a defense stat raised by multiple Iron Defense uses was simply ignored when a critical hit was applied. Wicked Blow essentially cleaned the battlefield of defensive preparation and stat manipulation in a single strike. Intimidate, one of the most common and impactful abilities in competitive play, had zero effect against it. Burns, which reduced attack by half, and were another significant form of offensive compromise, were also nullified. Wicked Blow hit as though the entire preceding battle had been irrelevant to the final calculation. Rapid Strike style Urshifu used Surging Strikes, a physical water type move that shared the guaranteed critical hit property of its counterpart, but delivered 3 hits instead of 1. Each hit individually guaranteed a critical strike, meaning all 3 landed with critical force. The total damage output was substantial, and the additional implication was that Surging Strikes would break through Focus Sash, a held item that prevented a Pokemon from being knocked out in a single hit, because the first strike activated the sash while the subsequent strikes ignored it. Regieleki and Regidrago were 2 new members of the ancient Reigi group who arrived in the Crown Tundra with signature moves that expressed the extremes of their respective types. Regieleki's Thunder Cage was a special electric type move with 80 base power that trapped the target in a prison of lightning for 4 to 5 turns. During that time, the target received continuous damage from the electrical cage and could not switch out of battle. Regieleki was described in the Pokédex as wearing rings on its body that functioned as limiters on its electrical output. The lore stated that the energy produced by Thunder Cage alone was sufficient to power the entire Galar region, which gave the move a sense of scale that exceeded its mechanical description. Regidrago's Dragon Energy was a special dragon-type move with 150 base power that operated on a diminishing returns formula. The move was at full power when Regidrago was at full health, and its power decreased proportionally as Regidrago lost health. This made Dragon Energy one of the few moves in the series where a creature's battle damage directly compromised its primary offensive tool, creating an urgency to land Dragon Energy early while the power was still complete. The Pokédex entry for Regidrago described its arms as being composed of the skull of an ancient dragon Pokemon that had never been officially revealed, which was one of the more tantalizing pieces of lore left deliberately unresolved in the series. Whatever dragon had contributed its remains to Regidrago's body was the source of the enormous power channeled through Dragon Energy. The 2 riders of the Crown Tundra, Calyrex in its horse-merged forms, produced signature moves that matched the aesthetics of their elemental domains with precision. Ice Rider Calyrex, the fusion of Calyrex with the legendary horse Glastrier, used Glacial Lance, a physical ice-type move with 120 base power that struck all opposing Pokemon simultaneously. The move had perfect accuracy and no negative drawbacks for the user. No recharge turn, no stat drops, no accuracy compromise, 120 base power with perfect accuracy, hitting both opponents without any cost. Glacial Lance was widely discussed as one of the most straightforwardly powerful physical moves in the franchise for this reason. Shadow Rider Calyrex, the fusion with Spectrier, used Astral Barrage, a special ghost-type move with 120 base power that struck all opposing Pokemon simultaneously with perfect accuracy and no drawbacks. The symmetry between Glacial Lance and Astral Barrage was complete. Both moves had identical base power, identical accuracy, identical targeting, and identical absence of cost. They were the physical and special versions of the same fundamental concept, a legendary of complete mastery expressing that mastery without any compromise. Astral Barrage's description referred to summoning a rain of spiritual energy that separated the opponent's soul from their physical body, a description that suited a ghost-type move associated with a legendary from the Land of the Dead. Enamorus was a Generation 8 legendary that rounded out the original forces of nature with a 4th member representing love and spring. Its signature move, Springtide Storm, was a special fairy-type attack with 100 base power that affected all opponents in a double battle simultaneously. Springtide Storm had a secondary effect that changed depending on which form Enamorus was in. The incarnate form, associated with the unpredictable energy of early spring, produced a different secondary result than the Therian form, which embodied something wilder and more forceful. The move's design reflected the dual nature of spring itself, which could arrive as gentle warming or as violent and unexpected storms, depending on the day. The combination of Springtide Storm with Inamoris's base accuracy, while not perfect, was compensated for by the spread damage potential and the form-dependent secondary effect. Adding a fairy-type legendary with signature spread damage to the forces of nature expanded the original trio's tactical range in Pokemon Legends in ways that suited the game's particular approach to large-scale battles. Paldea brought two Paradox legendaries, whose identities were built around the opposition between past and future, ancient and technological, organic and mechanical. Corydon and Muridon carried signature moves that expressed those identities while sharing a specific mechanical quality. Corydon's Collision Course was a physical fighting type attack with 100 base power. Muridon's Electro Drift was a special electric type attack with 100 base power. Both moves carried the same unusual property. If the move was super effective against the target, the damage received an additional 33% boost beyond the standard 2x multiplier for super effective attacks. This made both moves exceptionally powerful in the correct matchup. Electric and fighting coverage was already broad, and the bonus damage on top of the standard super effective calculation meant that opponents weak to either type faced a significantly higher number than they might have prepared for. Muridon's Hadron Engine ability, which passively boosted electric-type moves when electric terrain was active, added an additional multiplier that made Electro Drift mathematically one of the highest damage moves available in those conditions. The visual flavor of Collision Course referenced Corydon's motorcycle-like body and the burning tire animation that accompanied it, a nod to the ancient Paradox creature that resembled something between a dinosaur and a vehicle. Electro Drift suggested Muridon's futuristic electrical engine gliding through space with near frictionless efficiency. The Treasures of Ruin were 4 legendary Pokemon hidden in ancient vessels around Paldea, creatures imprisoned to prevent them from causing catastrophic harm. They shared a single signature move called Ruination, a dark-type attack that expressed their nature of absolute destruction in the most mathematically pure way possible. Ruination cut the target's current HP in half, not their maximum health, their remaining health. The target could be at 50%, and Ruination would reduce them to 25. They could be at 1 HP, and Ruination would never reduce them below 1. This was a move incapable of finishing a battle on its own, regardless of how many times it was used. The target could always theoretically survive through the halving mechanic, because half of any positive number was still a positive number. This made Ruination something genuinely unusual. It was less a weapon and more a persistent threat, a move designed not to end battles, but to compress health margins until the finishing blow from another source became trivial. Combined with any ordinary attack after Ruination's application, opponents found themselves in territory where even an ordinary move could knock them out. The move was control expressed as arithmetic. Ogerpon was the mask-wearing legendary of Paldea's Teal Mask DLC, a creature whose identity was tied to 4 different masks that changed her type and the type of her signature attack. Ivy Cudgel was a physical move with 100 base power and an elevated critical hit ratio. Without a mask, Ivy Cudgel was grass type. The Wellspring mask produced a water type version. The Hearthflame mask produced fire type. The Cornerstone mask produced rock type. But the interaction with the masks went beyond simply changing the type. Each mask functioned as a held item that boosted the corresponding type's moves by 20%, meaning Ivy Cudgel was not only the relevant type, but also boosted by the item providing that type. The same type attack bonus applied as well when Ogerpon's type and the move's type matched. The combination of the 20% mask boost and the standard same type attack bonus created a move that hit substantially harder than its base power suggested. Ivy Cudgel was widely recognized as one of the most powerful physical moves relative to its base power in the franchise, precisely because of the stacking of these boosts. Terapagos was the legendary at the center of Paldea's Indigo Disc expansion, a creature described as the origin of the Terrastall phenomenon, the mechanic that allowed Pokemon to take on crystalline forms and change or amplify their typing in battle. Its signature move, Terra Starstorm, was a special normal type move with 120 base power. In its base form, Terra Starstorm was a respectable normal type attack. But when Terrapagos transformed into its stellar form, the move became something without precedent in the game's history. The only move in the entire franchise that dealt super effective damage to any terrestrialized Pokemon, regardless of what type they had become. Terrestrialization allowed any Pokemon to change their type to anything during battle, often making them immune to what would normally be effective against them. Stellar form Terrapagos with Terra Starstorm bypassed this entirely. Whatever type the opponent had crystallized into, the move found a way through, treating the Terra type as something vulnerable rather than something transformed into protection. It was the origin of the phenomenon, asserting authority over its own creation. There is something worth sitting with as we reach the end of this journey together. The moves we have traveled through tonight were not simply mechanical tools. Each one told a story about the creature that used it, expressed something about what that Pokemon was at its deepest level, and reflected choices made by designers who understood that a signature move was a kind of language. Doom Desire was a wish sent through time, which was exactly what Jiraki would send. Psycho Boost was the explosive self-consumption of a creature that arrived from space with nothing to restrain it. Sacred Fire was the warmth of divine fire that could thaw even a frozen heart. Shadow Force was a creature from outside the normal world, stepping through a dimension that barriers could not reach. Glacial Lance and Astral Barrage were the pure, undivided mastery of a king and his horse, riding without compromise. Every move in this collection was a design decision that said something. Something about what kind of power a legendary held, what it valued, what it was willing to sacrifice, what it could do that nothing else could. The series has been telling these small stories for decades now, adding one signature move at a time to the library of what legendaries are and how they express themselves. What makes these attacks remarkable is not simply their numbers, but the care taken to make them feel inevitable, as though the Pokemon they belong to could not have had any other signature attack and remain fully itself. Jirachi could not have had Shadow Force. Giratina could not have had Geomancy. Each creature and its move exist in a relationship so close that removing one from the other would leave something incomplete in both. The world of Pokemon is full of creatures whose identities are built from precisely these kinds of details, layered quietly into mechanics and visuals and names for those who take the time to look for them. Each legendary signature move is one more layer, one more quiet corner of a world that rewards gentle attention. There is a particular quality to the silence that surrounds legendary Pokemon in the moments before they act. It is not simply the quiet of waiting. It is the compression of something enormous into a single instant before it releases. Every trainer who has stood across from a legendary Pokemon in battle knows the feeling of watching the world narrow to a single point of potential energy. These are the moments that signature moves are made for, the expressions that only come from creatures whose existence bends the world around them. When we talk about the design of signature moves across all 9 generations of Pokemon, we are really talking about the long history of designers asking a question that never fully resolved itself. What should a legendary feel like when it fights? What quality should a legendary's most personal attack convey about the creature using it? The answers across generations have been remarkably varied, which speaks to how genuinely the designers thought about each legendary individually rather than applying a formula. Some legendaries received moves of overwhelming power, others received moves of elegant utility, some received moves that expressed cost and trade-off, others received moves whose primary quality was a mechanical uniqueness that no other move in the game shared. Some moves were beautiful, and some were unsettling. Some felt warm, and some felt cold. The variety is itself the point, a reminder that legendaries were not all the same kind of thing, even if they all occupied similar positions in the game's hierarchy. The relationship between a legendary Pokemon and its signature move sometimes reveals something about where the designers began their thinking. Was the creature designed first and the move created to match it? Or did the move's concept lead to the creature's visual and narrative development? The answers are not always clear, but the question is worth holding in mind as we revisit some of these moves and the creatures they belong to. Jirachi's Doom Desire, for example, feels like a move that grew directly from Jirachi's established nature, a creature that grants wishes, that awakens once every 1,000 years, that contains enormous energy in a small and gentle body. Would naturally produce a move that was powerful but delayed, patient but inevitable. The move feels like an extension of personality rather than a mechanical decision made separately from the design. Compare this to something like Technoblast, Genesect's signature attack. Genesect was designed as a prehistoric bug modified by human scientists, a creature whose defining characteristic was the cannon mounted on its back and the drives that could change its elemental alignment. Technoblast feels like it emerged simultaneously with the drives as a concept, with the move and the item system being two parts of the same design idea expressed in different ways. The move is inseparable from the items, and the items exist specifically to give the move meaning. Both approaches produced memorable signature attacks, but they produced them differently. Doom Desire was a move shaped by character. Technoblast was a move shaped by a mechanical system that was itself designed to express character. Neither approach was better. Both reached something true about the creatures they described. The competitive history of legendary signature moves is a story of unexpected discoveries and adjustments. Moves that seemed reasonable on paper sometimes turned out to be substantially more powerful in practice when combined with specific partners, items, or terrain effects. Moves that seemed modest in isolation became central to dominant strategies when placed in the right context. Geomancy is one of the clearest examples. The two-turn charging requirement was meant to be a genuine cost, a meaningful trade-off for the 3-stat boost. In isolation, the design was reasonable. A very powerful effect should require preparation time. But the power herb interaction, which reduced the setup time to 0 in exchange for consuming an item, transformed the move's risk profile entirely. Suddenly, Xerneas could walk onto the field with a power herb, use Geomancy on the first turn with no vulnerability, and have its 3 stats boosted by 2 stages each before the opponent could react. The move became one of the most feared in competitive play precisely because the balance mechanism intended to limit it had an obvious counter. Similar dynamics appeared around Spectral Thief. In practice, teams built around stat accumulation strategies found themselves completely dismantled by Marshadow in ways that were frustrating to play against. The move's ability to steal every positive change before the hit meant that a Pokemon which had spent multiple turns building toward a sweep could lose all of that investment, plus take 90 base power physical damage in a single action. The combination was more punishing than any individual component suggested. Dark Void's nerf was a direct response to competitive reality. The original 80% accuracy in doubles was high enough to make sleep strategies built around it dominant rather than simply powerful. Reducing the accuracy and restricting the user addressed both the competitive problem and the thematic expectation that moves should only work fully for the creatures they were designed for. There is also a quieter tradition in legendary signature moves that sometimes goes unnoticed, the moves that were designed not for competitive impact, but for something more like narrative expression. Lunar Dance was one of these. It was not a move intended to dominate competitive play. Its value in standard battle formats was limited by the fact that it required Cresselia to faint, which was rarely the outcome a competitive trainer wanted from a defensive Pokemon. But Lunar Dance expressed something real about Cresselia's nature, the willingness to sacrifice itself so that another could be fully restored, that justified its existence entirely on those narrative grounds. Relic Song had a similar quality. The 10% sleep chance was useful, but not exceptional. The 75 base power was respectable, but not impressive. What made Relic Song meaningful was the form Change It triggered. The way it made the act of singing in battle a transformation rather than simply an attack. Using Relic Song was participating in Meloetta's story rather than simply executing a combat action. Take Heart for Manaphy and Phione was another example of a signature move whose primary value was narrative. The move was functional in competitive settings, providing status cure and stat boosts simultaneously. But its most important quality was that it gave two legendaries who had spent years in relative obscurity something that acknowledged their existence. The move said that Manaphy and Phione mattered enough to receive something designed specifically for them. This tradition of using signature moves to make statements about a Pokemon's place in the world, not just their place in battle, is one of the more touching aspects of how the series has evolved over time. The visual design of signature moves deserves its own moment of attention, because the animations and descriptions attached to these attacks are often where the most careful storytelling was placed. A move's base power and accuracy tell you what it does in mechanical terms. The visual tells you what it means. Judgment's animation showed beams of pure light falling in columns from the sky, which suited Arceus perfectly as a creature described as standing above all others and passing judgment from a position of absolute perspective. The columns of light carried an almost architectural quality, as though they were a structure being imposed on the world rather than simply energy being released into it. Fusion Flare and Fusion Bolt both had animations that referenced the other, showing fire and electricity interacting in ways that suggested the two moves were parts of a single event even when used separately. When the fusion combo activated and the powers doubled, the visual reflected that amplification through an expanded animation that made the connection between the two attacks explicit. Shadow Force's two-turn animation was particularly well conceived. Giratina's disappearance on the first turn was not simply an absence. It had a visual quality of slipping sideways out of the world, vanishing not through speed, but through a kind of orthogonal movement that suggested dimensions beyond the visible. The return on the second turn came from an unexpected angle, consistent with the idea that the distortion world allowed access to places unreachable through ordinary space. Core Enforcer's Z-shaped carving was a piece of environmental storytelling that required the player to already understand the context. The move carved a Z because Zygarde was the mascot of a game that did not exist, a reference to an unreleased Pokemon Z title that was rerouted into different projects. For players who knew this background, the Z glowing on the ground was a subtle acknowledgement of something the game would never directly explain. The question of which legendary signature move is the most important to the series' history does not have a single correct answer, but several candidates make themselves apparent when the full list is examined. Judgment has a claim to this status because of its scope. As a move that adapted to every type in the game, depending on its user's held item, it established a design template that was later used for Techno Blast, Multi-Attack, Ivy Cudgel, and others. Judgment was not simply one move. It was a proof of concept for a category of moves that changed their nature based on held items, a design space that the series returned to repeatedly across multiple generations. Dragon Ascent has a different kind of claim. As the only move in the history of the franchise capable of triggering a mega evolution, it created a unique mechanical relationship between a move and a transformation that no other Pokemon could replicate. For Rayquaza specifically, the move became not just an attack, but a state change, a key that unlocked a more powerful version of itself. The lore around why Rayquaza could achieve this without a Mega Stone, absorbing cosmic energy from the atmosphere itself, made the move more than just a mechanical curiosity. It made it a piece of world building. Thousand Arrows might have the strongest competitive claim, having changed the fundamental rules about ground-type moves and their targets. The ability to hit flying types and levitating Pokemon with a ground move reshaped certain matchups in ways that persisted across multiple generations of competitive play. A move that changed the rules of what a type could do had implications that ordinary high-power moves never produced. Spectral Thief might hold the crown for sheer creative audacity. Stealing positive stat changes before dealing damage was not simply a powerful effect. It was a conceptually aggressive move that treated the opponent's preparation as a resource to be taken rather than a threat to be survived. The idea behind Spectral Thief required thinking about the problem of setup differently than almost any other move in the game, and the result was something genuinely novel. There are also the signature moves that arrived decades later than they should have, late recognition for creatures that had waited a long time for something truly their own. Kyogre and Groudon are perhaps the most discussed cases, two of the most prominent legendaries in the series who spent 12 years without a proper signature attack. When Origin Pulse and Precipice Blades finally arrived with the Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire remakes, the competitive and casual community alike responded with genuine enthusiasm. The moves felt overdue. The Lake Guardians waited even longer. Uxie, Mesprit, and Ourself appeared in Generation 4 and did not receive a shared signature move until Pokemon Legends Arceus, a gap spanning multiple generations and console generations. When mystical power finally arrived, it was a modest move in terms of raw power, but the fact of its existence mattered independently of its statistics. These were three creatures whose lore described them as the emotional and cognitive foundation of all living beings, and having finally been given something to call their own felt like a correction of a long-standing absence. Mewtwo's Psystrike told a different story. Mewtwo was never overlooked in competitive play. The original legendary boss of Kanto was powerful from its first appearance and remained one of the most discussed Pokemon in competitive discussion for decades. Psystrike was not a correction for neglect. It was an addition to something already formidable, a move that said the designers understood what would make Mewtwo genuinely complete rather than simply powerful. The design of signature moves for dual-form legendaries presented specific challenges that single-form legendaries did not face. Hoopa in its two forms, Kyurem in its three fusion states, Calyrex in its two rider forms, Zygarde across its multiple completion levels, and the Urshifu styles all required moves that expressed each form's specific nature while also feeling coherent with each other. The Hoopa solution was direct. Two different moves with different types and different power levels express the contrast between the playful confined form and the ancient dangerous unbound form clearly and without ambiguity. Hyperspace Hole was mischievous and psychic. Hyperspace Fury was overwhelming and dark. The shared property of bypassing Protect acknowledged that both forms of Hoopa understood that barriers were irrelevant to it. Kyurem's solution was more complex because it required coordinating three states: the base form, the Zekrom fusion, and the Reshiram fusion. Glaciate expressed Kyurem's emptiness and cold in a move that was functional but not overwhelming, the smallest of the three. Freeze Shock and Ice Burn each expressed the fusion with a different partner by combining elemental properties in unusual ways. Ice that paralyzed borrowed electricity from Zekrom. Ice that burned borrowed fire from Reshiram. The hybrid moves were mechanically strange but thematically precise. Calyrex's approach produced the most symmetrical result. Glacial Lance and Astral Barrage were mirror images of each other in every mechanical sense, which suited two forms of the same legendary king better than different move structures would have. The king was whole regardless of which horse it rode, and the moves reflected that completeness. When competitive players discuss legendary signature moves, they often categorize them by their relationship to the broader metagame at the time of their introduction. Some moves arrived in environments that suited them perfectly and became dominant strategies almost immediately. Others arrived in environments where their specific strengths were not as relevant, and they made less immediate impact. Wicked Blow and Surging Strikes both arrived in Generation 8 in a competitive environment where Dynamax had fundamentally changed the pace and structure of battles. The guaranteed critical hit properties made both moves extraordinary counters to the defensive structures that Dynamax battles often relied on. The critical hits bypassed the massive defensive stat increases that Dynamaxed Pokemon displayed, making Urshifu one of the most reliable tools for dealing with Dynamax strategies in ways that other Pokemon could not replicate. Glacial Lance arrived in a generation where physical ice coverage was genuinely rare at the level of power it offered. Ice as a defensive type was widely considered weak, but Ice as an offensive type against Dragon, Flying, Grass, and Ground types was valuable. A physical Ice move with 120 base power, perfect accuracy, and spread damage that hit both opponents simultaneously was something the physical Ice move category had never seen before. And competitive teams that incorporated Ice Rider Calyrex found themselves with a physical threat that very few Pokemon could absorb reliably. Collision Course and Electro Drift both arrived with a super effective damage bonus that created specific situations where they exceeded the base power of almost any other move in the game. Miraidon in particular, with Hadron Engine boosting electric moves on electric terrain and the Electro Drift bonus against super effective targets stacking on top, produced numbers that competitive analysts described as nearly unprecedented for a single regular move. The mythical Pokemon of the series occupy a slightly different position in the legendary signature move tradition. While legendary Pokemon are typically obtainable through the main story or in specific locations, mythicals were historically distributed through events, limited time promotions, or special distributions that made them rarer and their moves sometimes less deeply integrated into the competitive environment. Victini's V-Create was perhaps the exception. The 180 base Power Fire type physical move was distributed specifically because it was not Victini's standard move pool option in most games, requiring a special event Victini to access it. This created an unusual situation where one of the most powerful moves in the game was attached to a mythical who received it through a mechanism outside the ordinary flow of play. V-Create became something players sought out specifically, elevating Victini from a secondary consideration to a genuine competitive presence when available. Marshadow's Spectral Thief was another mythical move that immediately impacted competitive discussions. Because Marshadow itself was distributed through limited events, the move's impact was initially theoretical rather than widespread. But as more players acquired Marshadow through legitimate means, and the theoretical analysis of Spectral Thief was confirmed in practice, the move became recognized as one of the most disruptive in the entire series. Pesherant arrived more recently, and Malignant Chain's combination with the Poison Puppeteer ability gave it an immediate reputation for battlefield control that made competitive players pay attention even though Pesherant had not been available through ordinary gameplay for extended periods. The combination of abilities and signature move working together as a single system was one of the more complete design packages among recent mythicals. There is a meditative quality in going through these moves one by one that the pace of ordinary gameplay rarely produces. In a battle, a signature move is simply an action taken at speed, a choice made in the flow of a match. Here, removed from the urgency of combat, each move has time to be considered for what it expresses rather than simply what it does. Aeroblast, coming from a creature that controls storms and whose careless wing movements can cause 40-day tempests, is a focused beam of aerial energy that suggests Lugia exercising restraint and precision rather than its full destructive potential. The high critical hit ratio is the small unpredictability that any storm contains, the moment where the wind does more than expected. Sacred Fire from Ho-Oh is warmth that can hurt, which is true of all fire, but particularly true of a fire called Sacred. The Divine Fire is the kind that can heal, and the kind that can burn depending on how it touches you. The 50% burn chance is the danger built into something fundamentally warm. Ho-Oh does not change when it uses Sacred Fire. The fire is what it is. The target's relationship with it is what determines the outcome. Origin Pulse from Kyogre is water as creation, the primordial ocean calling out with rings of blue light. The visual of countless glowing circles expanding from the point of impact is less like an attack and more like a ripple in the fabric of something foundational. As though Kyogre's move was not striking an opponent, but simply asserting the presence of water as the first element from which all other things grew. Precipice Blades from Groudon is the answer to that, stone as permanence, land declaring itself against the ocean's assertion. The blades rising from the ground do not come from Groudon's body. They come from the earth itself at Groudon's command, which is the correct image for a creature whose power is not contained within itself, but expressed through its relationship with the world beneath every footstep. Dragon Ascent carries a particular resonance because of what it unlocks. The transformation it triggers is not simply an increase in statistics. It is the highest expression of what Rayquaza can become, the version of itself that has fully absorbed the cosmic energy it requires. When Rayquaza uses Dragon Ascent, the move and the transformation tell the same story simultaneously. The ascent is real, both the literal rise into the stratosphere and the becoming of something more complete. What is interesting about Mega Evolution as a mechanic is that for all other Pokemon, it was tied to stones, to crystallized energy that existed externally. For Rayquaza alone, the transformation was interior, generated by a move that described gathering what the creature already had access to and concentrating it deliberately. Rayquaza was not changed by an external catalyst. It changed by doing what it was already doing, ascending, gathering, becoming. This made Dragon Ascent philosophically different from other Mega Evolution triggers, even though it functioned identically in mechanical terms. The difference was not in what the mechanic did, but in what the mechanic said. For Rayquaza, Mega Evolution was not receiving something. It was allowing something already present to be fully expressed. The tradition of shared signature moves, where multiple legendary Pokemon access the same exclusive attack, appears several times across the generations. Sacred Sword was initially shared among all four Swords of Justice. The Lake Trio shared mystical power. The forces of nature each had their own individual storm move, but with a common structure. Nature's Madness belonged to all four guardian deities of Alola. Ruination was shared among all four Treasures of Ruin. Each shared signature move reflected something about the relationships between the creatures sharing it. The Swords of Justice shared Sacred Sword because they were a group, a team defined by their common purpose and the story they enacted together. The move's legendary status came not from one creature's uniqueness, but from the significance of what they represented collectively. Nature's Madness expressed the guardian deities' shared quality of being elemental protectors rather than combatants in the ordinary sense. The move was not designed to end battles. It was designed to diminish opponents significantly, to take something from them, which suited creatures whose role was protective rather than aggressive. Ruination sharing among the Treasures of Ruin reflected the lore that positioned them as unified forces of destruction contained by the same cultural memory, imprisoned in the same style of vessel, representing different faces of the same essential catastrophe. Four different creatures with four different typings, expressing the same destructive principle in the same move, felt thematically correct for entities who were variations on a single apocalyptic idea. The experience of playing through a legendary encounter for the first time and seeing the signature move in action is one of the more memorable categories of experience the series offers. The moment when Lugia rises from the water in a cutscene and the player encounters Aeroblast for the first time in battle, or when the player first faces the cover legendary of their game and the unique move appears in the battle interface, creates a kind of recognition. The creature you have been hearing about, the Pokemon on the box, is now here in front of you, doing the thing that only it can do. These moments accumulate across a player's experience with the series into something like a personal history of legendary encounters. Every player who has played Pokemon Ruby remembers their first encounter with Kyogre or Groudon. Every player who has played Diamond or Pearl remembers standing in Spear Pilar facing Dialga or Palkia. The signature moves are part of those memories because they appear in those defining moments, expressing the character of the legendary at precisely the time when the player is most attentive to what the creature is. The fact that a player might not know the specific mechanics of the move in that first encounter only adds to the experience. The power is communicated before the numbers are understood. Doom Desire's delayed strike creates a specific feeling of anticipation that teaches the player something about Jirachi before any explanation is offered. Shadow Force's disappearance creates a moment of disorientation that communicates Giratina's relationship with dimensionality more effectively than any Pokédex entry could. Design that works on this level, communicating meaning through experience before analysis, is the mark of something made with genuine attention to how it would be encountered rather than simply how it would function. As the series has expanded from 151 Pokemon to numbers in the multiple hundreds, the density of legendary and mythical creatures has grown correspondingly. Each new generation brought more creatures requiring signature moves, which meant more opportunities to develop novel mechanics and more pressure to ensure that each new move was genuinely distinct from what had come before. Looking at the full collection from Generation 3's Doom Desire through Generation 9's Terra Starstorm, the range of mechanical approaches is striking. Delayed strikes, guaranteed critical hits, stat stealing, type changing based on held items, ability suppression, HP halving, accuracy modification under weather conditions, power scaling with remaining health, secondary stat effects with unusually high probabilities, trapping effects, form changing, healing effects, simultaneous multi stat boosts. No two moves in the collection are mechanically identical. This variety suggests that each new legendary signature move was genuinely treated as a design problem, requiring a new solution rather than a template to be repeated with different numbers. Certain structural parallels exist: the Behemoth Blade and Behemoth Bash pairing, the Fusion Flare and Fusion Bolt pairing, the various moves that shared type-changing properties. But even within these parallels, each move was given a specific identity that distinguished it from its companion. The commitment to mechanical novelty across an expanding collection of over 60 individual signature moves is itself an achievement, a sign that the designers maintained genuine interest in the design space even as that space became more crowded with each generation. There is something to be said for the quiet dignity of a move that is simply very good without trying to be novel. Aeroblast and Sacred Fire, Lugia and Ho-Oh's respective signature attacks, are moves whose value comes not from unusual mechanics, but from reliable effectiveness, combined with a secondary effect above standard probability. They are the simplest category of signature move design, but they are not the lesser for it. Aeroblast's high critical rate gave Lugia an offensive presence that complemented its primarily defensive identity without requiring elaborate setup. Sacred Fire's extraordinary burn rate gave Ho-Oh a move that could compromise opponents reliably rather than occasionally. Both moves felt complete as expressions of their user's power without needing additional layers of complexity. The later generations trend toward more elaborate mechanics and signature moves, which reflects both the series' maturation and the competitive environment's increasing sophistication. A simple high-power move with a good secondary rate would not feel special enough for a Generation 9 Legendary the way it might have for a Generation 2 Legendary. The expectations have risen alongside the mechanical complexity of the games themselves, but the simplicity of Aeroblast and Sacred Fire had its own kind of elegance. They were right for Lugia and Ho-Oh in the same way that Doom Desire was right for Jiraki, not because simplicity was superior to complexity, but because the match between the move and the creature was exact. The criterion was never mechanical sophistication, it was the quality of fit between what the move expressed and what the creature was. The final generation before this journey concludes was Paldea, a region that brought Paradox legendaries, ancient and future versions of Pokemon whose existence described the relationship between time and form in ways the series had not previously explored. Corydon and Miraidon were not simply strong Pokemon, they were companions, carried by the player through the game's main story in a way that built a more extended relationship than most legendary encounters. This relationship made Collision Course and Electro Drift feel differently than they might have otherwise. By the time a player first faced an opponent's Corydon or Miraidon or used their own companion in battle, there was a familiarity built over hours of traversing Paldea together. The signature moves were the expression of creatures the player had come to know in a different way than catching them in a traditional encounter would have produced. Collision Course described Koraidon's identity precisely: a physical fighting type move that hit harder when super effective, mirroring the prehistoric creature's instinct to commit completely when it found the right target, to throw its full weight into the encounter without reservation. The motorcycle burnout animation was an anachronism on a prehistoric creature, but an endearing one. A reminder that Koraidon was a paradox, ancient and dynamic simultaneously. Electro Drift described Miraidon's identity with equal precision. The future motorcycle dragon gliding through an electric arc, the bonus damage against super effective targets stacking with its already amplified electric moves, the mathematical perfection of an engine designed to extract maximum output from every situation. Miraidon was efficiency as aesthetics, and Electro Drift was efficiency as combat. A move is never simply a move when it belongs to a legendary. It is the creature speaking in the only language that battle allows, through force and energy and transformation, saying something about what it is and how it relates to the world that contains it. The best signature moves say those things clearly and memorably. The history of legendary signature moves is a history of the series learning to speak more fluently in that language, adding precision and depth with each new generation, finding new ways to make a single attack tell a story that nothing else could. From the gentle delay of Doom Desire to the crystalline reach of Terra Starstorm, from the stolen stat boosts of Spectral Thief to the self-sacrificing restoration of Lunar Dance, the collection of legendary signature moves is a library of moments where design and intention aligned closely enough to produce something that felt exactly right. Not every move in the collection achieved that alignment perfectly, but enough of them did, in enough different ways, to suggest that the designers were genuinely listening to each creature as they created its most personal technique. The Pokemon that carry these moves have been companions, rivals, forces of nature, gods, and mysteries. Their signature attacks are the most specific things about them in the language of battle, the one expression that belongs to each creature alone. That belonging is worth something. It is worth the care that produced it, and it is worth the attention you have given it tonight. The world is quiet now. The legendaries have returned to their places in the world, each one carrying its signature, moved back into the silence with it. Lugia has descended beneath the waves. Giratina has slipped back through the boundary into its distant world. Arceus has returned to the Hall of Origin and the long patience of something that was there before everything else and will be there after. Whatever Pokemon you first loved, whatever legendary first made you understand what the series was capable of, there is a move somewhere in this collection that expressed exactly that creature at exactly the moment you needed it to. That moment was not accidental. It was designed, with care, for you and for everyone who has ever stood in quiet awe before something that could do what nothing else could do. There is another way to think about signature moves that the mechanical descriptions and competitive analyses only partially capture. Each of these attacks exists inside a specific visual and emotional language that the series has built over decades, a shared vocabulary of what power looks and feels like in the world of Pokemon. To understand any one move fully, it helps to understand where it sits within that broader visual and emotional tradition. The series began its relationship with powerful moves through things like Hyper Beam, a general-purpose high-power attack that anyone could teach to their Pokemon. Hyper Beam was strong and memorable, and its recharge requirement made it feel like something that cost the user something real, but it was available to almost any Pokemon capable of learning it, which meant it could not carry the specific meaning of belonging to one creature alone. Signature moves stepped into the space that Hyper Beam and similar universal power moves could not occupy. They said something that universal moves could never say, which was that this particular attack, in this particular form, with this particular combination of properties, existed because this particular creature existed, and for no other reason. The specificity was the point. When Lugia used Aeroblast, the flying type beam was not simply different from Hyper Beam in type and accuracy. It carried the accumulated associations of everything the player understood about Lugia at the moment of use, the silver guardian of the sea. The creature too powerful to be near other Pokemon safely, the keeper of the three birds, the being that could stop a storm or cause one. All of those associations traveled into the move, even though none of them were written in the move's description. This is what signature moves do at their best. They absorb the meaning of their user and carry it into battle as a kind of concentrated expression. The mechanical details provide the structure. The creature's identity provides the resonance. When both are well designed, the move feels inevitable. Spatial Rend, Palkia's reality-tearing signature, was particularly successful at this. The move description explained the mechanics, the name explained the concept, but the experience of Palkia using Spatial Rend in battle said something more. Here was a creature whose entire identity was built around the fabric of space, a dragon that could move between dimensions, and whose lore described it as maintaining the very structure of three-dimensional reality. When it attacked by tearing that fabric. The weapon was made of the same substance as the wielder's fundamental nature. Heatran's Magma Storm achieved something similar, not by being the strongest move available to Heatran, but by trapping its target inside a vortex of exactly what Heatran was, a creature born in volcanic rock and living comfortably in temperatures that could melt solid ground attacked by surrounding its enemy with the material of its home. Magma Storm was not Heatran attacking from outside. It was Heatran extending its environment to enclose someone who had entered its territory. Shadow Force was possibly the most elegant expression of this principle in the entire collection. Giratina disappeared into the distortion world, moved through it, and returned from an angle that bypassed every protective barrier. The move did not simply go through Protect, it went through the space in which Protect was irrelevant, the dimension where ordinary rules did not apply. Giratina fought from the one location no defensive measure could reach, which was the dimension it had been exiled to and learned to call home. The question of what legendaries mean to players who have grown up with the series is inseparable from the question of what their signature moves meant. Many players can name the first legendary they encountered and remember the signature move that appeared in that encounter as part of the same memory. The move is part of the encounter's texture, one of the specific sensory details that makes the memory coherent and retrievable. For a generation of players who began with Pokemon Ruby and Sapphire, that encounter was often with Kyogre or Groudon. At the time, neither had a proper signature move, which meant that the encounter's mechanical dimension was defined by the powerful but non-exclusive moves in their pool. Origin Pulse and Precipice Blades arrived years later through remakes, changing the relationship between those creatures and their battle identity. Players who experienced both the original games and the remakes had the unusual experience of retroactively discovering what these creatures' encounters could have been. For players who came later, encountering Kyogre with Origin Pulse or Groudon with Precipice Blades for the first time, the moves were simply part of what these legendaries were. They could not imagine Kyogre without the blue rings of water or Groudon without the stone blades rising from the earth. The later design felt inevitable to those who had only ever known it, which suggests something interesting about how signature moves function in the series' cultural memory. They become definitional. Once they exist, the creatures they belong to feel incomplete without them. The difference between a signature move that feels definitive and one that feels like a mechanic is sometimes as small as a name. The naming of signature moves was its own design discipline, requiring words that communicated the concept clearly, while also carrying the specific resonance of the creature they belonged to. Doom Desire was a name that brought two words together in unexpected combination. Doom was weighty and final. Desire was personal and motivated. The combination suggested something wished for, with the full weight of consequence acknowledged, which was exactly right for a creature that granted wishes and understood that wishes had power. Oblivion Wing had the opposite structure, two words that made complete sense together, but produced an image more beautiful than either word alone. A wing made of oblivion, or perhaps a wing extended toward oblivion, or the wing stroke that produced it. The ambiguity was useful because it allowed the name to carry multiple meanings simultaneously. Spectral Thief was precise and accurate, which suited the move it named, a spectral creature that stole things, clear, honest, and slightly ominous. The name gave no false impressions about what the move was. Nihil Light was perhaps the most philosophically dense name in the collection. Nihil, from the Latin word for nothing, combined with light as the thing most opposed to nothing, a light of nothingness, or a light that erased, a beam of absolute negation. The name suited a move that was described as amplifying Core Enforcer into something of apocalyptic scale. Terra Starstorm captured its move's identity in two words that both described what it was and referenced the mechanic it engaged with. Terra for Terrastall, and Starstorm for the celestial shower that the animation depicted. Of all the recent Generation 9 signature move names, it felt most natural as a phrase, something that could be read without explanation and produce a clear image. Some signature moves exist at the boundary between what a move is designed to do in battle and what it is designed to show about the world the series inhabits. Jungle Healing is a clear example. As a battle move, it healed and cured status. As a world-building element, it said something about the nature of the jungle ecosystem Zarude embodied. The jungle was not simply a place to fight through. It was a place with its own restorative properties, capable of mending things that had been damaged simply by being fully present in it. Lunar Dance carried even more of this dual function. As a battle move, it was a sacrifice play that fully restored the Pokémon that replaced Cresselia. As a world-building element, it described a creature whose relationship with life and restoration was so complete that even its own end could be converted into healing for another. Cresselia's lore described it as the antithesis of Darkrai, the lunar light that dispersed nightmare. Lunar Dance was Cresselia's ultimate expression of that relationship, transforming its own existence into light for something that needed it. Geomancy operated similarly, but in a different register. Xerneas was described as a legendary, capable of granting eternal life, a creature so connected to the world's living energy that it could share that energy with others. Geomancy was not simply a stat boost. It was the visual expression of Xerneas, drawing all of that living energy into itself in preparation for releasing it. The charging animation, with its 7 colored glowing horns, was not a delay. It was the gathering, the preparation for an act of enormous generosity, dressed in the visual language of power. The relationship between signature moves and the stories told in Pokemon games has evolved over time in interesting ways. Early generations used signature moves primarily as battle mechanics, with lore attached to them afterward in Pokédex entries. The move came first, the story explaining it came second. Later generations began integrating signature moves more directly into narrative events. Relic Song changed Meloetta's form mid-battle in ways that the story acknowledged. Secret Sword triggered Keldeo's transformation into its resolute form as part of the narrative of Keldeo becoming fully itself. Dragon Ascent enabled Rayquaza's Mega Evolution as a plot point in the story of Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire. Terra Starstorm's ultimate power in stellar form was tied directly to Terrapagos's role in the Indigo Disc narrative. This integration of signature moves into the stories being told gave those moves a narrative weight that purely mechanical design could not achieve. Secret Sword was not simply a strong fighting type move. It was the move that made Keldeo into what it always had the potential to be, and the game made that transformation literal through the form change it triggered. The move had story consequences that mattered independently of its battle utility. The trend toward this kind of narrative integration suggests that the designers recognized signature moves as belonging to the story as much as to the battle system. A move that only mattered in battle was doing half the work that a signature move could do. A move that mattered in both contexts was fully expressing the creature it belonged to. There is one more quality worth noting about legendary signature moves before this journey draws to its close, which is the quality of surprise. The best signature moves were surprising in ways that felt inevitable in retrospect. Before Spectral Thief existed, the idea of a move that stole positive stat changes would have seemed novel to the point of being unexpected. After Spectral Thief existed, it was impossible to imagine what else Marshadow's signature move could have been. Before Thousand Arrows existed, a ground-type move hitting flying types would have seemed like a violation of the game's fundamental type interaction rules. After Thousand Arrows existed, the idea of Zygarde, a creature described as monitoring the ecosystem and maintaining balance. Having a move that could ground even the airborne made complete sense. Of course, a creature responsible for ecological order would have a move that could bring anything back to Earth when circumstances required it. Before Photon Geyser existed, a move that dynamically chose between attack and special attack in real time was not part of the game's mechanical vocabulary. After Photon Geyser existed, it was the obvious move for a creature described as a living prism, capable of taking the energy it received and refracting it in whatever direction was most effective. This quality of retroactive inevitability is one of the best things a signature move design can achieve. It means that the move was not simply added to the creature, it was discovered within the creature, extracted from what the creature already was, and expressed in mechanical form. When that happens, the signature move becomes as much a part of the creature's identity as its visual design or its lore. It becomes something that players immediately associate with the Pokémon, carrying both the mechanical memory and the emotional one forward through every encounter that followed. The legendaries that carry these moves have been waiting in their mountains and their seas and their distortion worlds, carrying their signature attacks with them, ready for the moment when a trainer would arrive and give them the opportunity to express what they were fully. Every legendary is still out there in the world. Jirachi sleeps in its comet, its doom desire, ready for the moment it wakes. Lugia guards the seas, Aeroblast concentrated into a potential that waits for the moment of expression. Giratina walks the distortion world, Shadow Force available whenever ordinary space becomes relevant again. They have not forgotten their moves. A legendary's signature attack is not something that fades. It is as permanent as the creature itself, as much a part of what it means to be that Pokemon as the color of its scales or the shape of its wings. The moves we have journeyed through tonight are still out there, still belonging to the same creatures that have always carried them, waiting for the next trainer to encounter them and experience for the first time what it feels like to stand across from something that can do what nothing else can do. That moment will come for many players who have not yet experienced it. And when it comes, they will understand what all of this has been describing. Not in words, but in the experience of encountering something whose power is expressed specifically, personally, in the one attack that could only ever belong to it. That understanding needs no explanation. It arrives complete. The landscape of legendary Pokemon signature moves cannot be fully appreciated without spending some time with the Generation 4 creatures that defined the philosophical heart of the series. Sinnoh was a region built around the question of origins, the creation of time and space, the architecture of existence itself, and the moves its legendaries carried reflected that weight in ways that no other generation quite matched. Dialga and Palkia stood at the center of this, two creatures whose entire purpose in the mythology was to maintain the structures without which nothing else could function. Time without Dialga would collapse into incoherence. Space without Palkia would fold into nothing. The stakes of their existence were absolute, which meant the moves they carried needed to feel proportional to that absoluteness. Roar of Time achieved this through scale rather than novelty. 150 base power was a number that communicated enormity. The recharge requirement acknowledged that manipulating time was not something that could be done without consequence. There was something honest about a move that represented time distortion, requiring the user to wait for time to settle afterward. The mechanics told the same story as the lore. Spatial Rend achieved it through concept rather than scale. 100 base power was respectable but not overwhelming. The high critical hit ratio introduced variability. What made Spatial Rend feel significant was entirely the idea of it, that the fabric of space could be torn as a combat technique, that a dragon whose nature was to maintain spatial integrity could also choose to violate it with precision. The move expressed the power not through numbers, but through the specific quality of what was being done. Giratina's Shadow Force completed the Sinnoh Dragon trio by addressing the third element in the cosmology, the distortion that existed alongside time and space as their necessary shadow. The distortion world was the place where the rules that governed time and space did not apply, and Shadow Force was the move that allowed Giratina to fight from within that exemption. The 120 base power was strong. The two-turn structure created risk and reward. But the property of bypassing protect and detect was the mechanical expression of the philosophical point. In the distortion world, the concept of protection through ordinary means was irrelevant. Shields worked in the space where the attacker was present. If the attacker was in a space where the shields had no jurisdiction, the shields accomplished nothing. Giratina's exile to the distortion world was described in the lore as a consequence of its violence, a banishment to a place separate from the world it had disturbed. Shadow Force transformed that exile into a strategic advantage. The very place Giratina had been sent to as punishment became the source of its most distinctive power. The creature that had been separated from the world fought from that separation as its primary technique. There is something worth sitting with in that reversal. The thing that isolated Giratina became the thing that made Giratina powerful in exactly the way nothing else could be. The move did not overcome the exile. The move used the exile, transformed the condition of separation into the condition of advantage. This was not a coincidence of design. It was a precise alignment between lore and mechanics that produced one of the most thematically coherent signature moves in the collection. Creselia's pair of signature moves occupied a quieter register than the Dragoness forces of Sinnoh's creation myth, but they were among the most emotionally intelligent moves in the game's history. Lunar Dance asked a player to make a genuine sacrifice, to send Cresselia out knowing it would not return from that action, understanding that the benefit to the Pokemon that replaced it was complete, but that Cresselia's continued participation was over. This was a move that required commitment in a way that most battle actions did not. Using a healing item, switching a Pokemon out, using a regular move, all of these preserved options for the future. Lunar Dance permanently ended one option while completely restoring another. The decision had a finality that most battle choices lacked. The emotional resonance of that finality was unusual in a competitive game context. Most competitive thinking was about preserving resources, maintaining options, keeping possibilities open. Lunar Dance was structurally opposed to that instinct. It said that sometimes the best path forward was to give everything in a single act of restoration and trust that what arrived in Cresselia's place would be worth the cost. Lunar Blessing, added later through Pokemon Legends, gave Cresselia a different tool, one that sustained rather than sacrificed, that could be returned to again and again. The existence of both moves created a fuller picture of what Cresselia was as a support presence. The extreme sacrifice when the situation demanded it. The reliable, ongoing healing when sustainability was more valuable than a single complete restoration. Generation 5 built its legendary mythology around an unusual abstract opposition. Where Generation 4 had asked about the nature of existence itself, Generation 5 asked about the nature of belief, specifically the question of whether truth or ideals was the more valuable foundation for a life. Reshiram represented truth. Zekrom represented ideals. Kiram represented the emptiness that existed when neither was present. The three dragons were not simply powerful creatures in a region, they were a philosophical argument expressed in dragon form. Fusion Flare and Fusion Bolt were the moves that expressed the specific relationship between truth and ideals most clearly. Both moves were strong individually, both became dramatically more powerful when they worked together. When the fire of truth and the electricity of ideals struck in sequence in the same turn. The 200 base power the combo produced was the game's way of showing that truth and ideals were not opposites in a simple sense. At their most complete, they amplified each other. The fusions that produced Black Kirim and White Kirim were the lore's way of showing that even emptiness could be filled when combined with either quality. Iceburn and Freeze Shock, the hybrid moves of the fused forms, were the mechanical expression of that filling. The emptiness that Kirim was had absorbed something from each combination, and the moves that resulted carried both elements simultaneously in ways that were thermodynamically strange and thematically precise. The blue flame of Reshiram's blue flare was scientific accuracy dressed in mythological form. The hottest fires burned blue. If Reshiram embodied the absolute truth of what fire was at its most complete, its flames should be blue. The design was visually beautiful and intellectually honest at the same time, which was exactly right for a creature whose entire identity was built around the concept of truth. The Alola region brought a different relationship between legendaries and their stories. Where Sinnoh had been about cosmic scale and Generation 5 had been about abstract philosophy, Alola was about community, about the relationship between Pokemon and the people who lived alongside them, and about what it meant to receive and give care. Manaphy and Phione's Take Heart expressed this beautifully. A status move that cured conditions and raised stats simultaneously was not the most powerful move design available. It would not win battles by itself. But it expressed something true about what these creatures were, small mythicals connected deeply to water, whose inner nature was the restoration of health and harmony. The move suited them precisely because it was not about overwhelming force, but about renewal and continuation. Nature's madness, shared among the four guardian deities of Alola, carried the protective quality of those creatures directly into its mechanics. The guardian deities were not conquerors, they were guardians, and their signature move reflected that by diminishing rather than destroying, by taking something from a threat rather than eliminating it. Half the remaining health each time expressed a persistent reduction rather than a decisive ending, which suited creatures whose role was to maintain a territory's safety rather than to engage in battles of domination. Sunsteel Strike and Moongeist Beam together express the particular quality of Alola's celestial legendaries, creatures so tied to the fundamental properties of light and darkness that their attacks transformed the conditions of the world around them. The sun's presence made night into day. The moon's presence made day into night. In battle, this became the visual poetry of moves that carried the properties of their users into the space of the fight itself. The Ultra Beasts that appeared in Alola occupied an uncertain position in the legendary move tradition because their nature as creatures from beyond the Ultra Wormholes complicated the concept of regional identity that other legendary signature moves carried. The Ultra Beasts were not Alolan creatures in the same sense that Tapu Koko or Solgaleo were. They were visitors, intruders, existential threats whose presence destabilized what was normally stable. This quality expressed itself in what the Ultra Beasts could and could not do. Signature moves, as the series designed them, were almost exclusively given to traditionally recognized legendaries and mythicals rather than Ultra Beasts, which had their own unusual abilities and stat profiles, but mostly operated within the framework of ordinary powerful moves rather than exclusive techniques. The exception was Silvally, which was itself an artificial creation designed specifically to counter Ultra Beasts. Its multi-attack signature was in every sense a human attempt to replicate legendary adaptability, which made the move's design comment on the difference between naturally occurring power and manufactured approximation. Multi-attack worked. It was a good competitive move, but it was also, by the game's own lore, a copy of something it could not fully replicate. Judgment was divine. Multi-attack was engineered. The distinction mattered even if the mechanics were similar. The scale of ambition in Necrozma's signature moves reflected a creature whose backstory described it as a being of absolute light that had been shattered and diminished, existing in the game as a fragment of what it had once been. The moves it carried seemed to acknowledge that backstory in their design. Prismatic Laser's overwhelming 160 base power felt like a creature reaching back toward the power it had once held, firing everything it had accumulated into a single enormous discharge. The recharge requirement was not a weakness in the ordinary sense. It was the aftermath of a being that had expended something fundamental, something that required recovery time because it was not simply energy, but a quality more essential than that. Photon Geyser's adaptive calculation between physical and special attack described something about a shattered light that had not lost its capacity to find the most effective angle. A prism did not simply transmit light unchanged. It refracted it, separating it into its components and redirecting each in the direction that suited it. Photon Geyser was Necrozma, doing what a prism did, applying its power through whichever channel was currently most effective, finding the angle of maximum damage as though by instinct. The combination of the two moves described a creature that had been damaged but not defeated, that still possessed the capacity for enormous force and the intelligence to apply it optimally. Necrozma's story was one of loss and potential recovery, and its signature moves carried both the loss and the potential in their design. The Crown Tundra DLC for Pokemon Sword and Shield created a specific context for its legendary signature moves that the main games did not always provide. The DLC was structured around expeditions into a remote and ancient landscape, encounters with Pokemon that carried deep historical significance for the Galar region and for the broader mythology of the series. Calyrex in particular had a narrative of loss and reunion, a king who had lost his steeds and whose power had diminished with them. When Calyrex reunited with Glastrier or Spectrier and the fused riders took battle-ready form, the signature moves they carried felt like the recovery of something that had been absent. Glacial Lance and Astral Barrage were not new powers. They were powers that had always been there, waiting for the union that would allow them to be expressed. The design choice to make these moves equally matched in every mechanical dimension was a statement about Calyrex's nature. The Ice Rider and the Shadow Rider were not better or worse than each other. They were different expressions of the same complete power, the king's authority manifesting through the specific quality of each horse's nature. Glacial Lance was physical and cold and permanent, like frozen ground. Astral Barrage was special and spectral and pervasive, like the presence of shadows at night. Both were the same king, which was why both moves had the same power and the same accuracy and the same complete absence of cost or limitation. The signature moves from later generations sometimes carry the weight of the series' increasing self-awareness. The designers know the history, they know what came before. When they create a new legendary signature move, they are working in a tradition that now spans decades and dozens of entries. The decisions they make are made with that tradition in view. Ivy Cudgel's type-changing mechanic echoed Judgment and Technoblast and Multi-Attack, placing it in a lineage of moves that expressed versatility through adaptability. But Ivy Cudgel distinguished itself from all of those predecessors by combining the type change with a 20% damage boost from the mask as item, a detail that made it mechanically distinct from everything that had come before. The lineage was acknowledged, and then exceeded. Terra Starstorm's stellar form power arrived as the final statement of Generation 9's engagement with the terrestrial mechanic, a signature move whose ultimate expression was to treat the very mechanic that defined the generation's transformation system as something the user's power could reach through completely. In stellar form, Terrapagos did not use terrestrial advantages. It transcended them, treating any terrestrialized Pokemon as vulnerable to its power rather than protected by their transformation. This was design that looked inward at the generation's own systems and found a way to have its central legendary comment on them, not by ignoring them or breaking them, but by showing that the origin of the mechanic retained a relationship with it, that went deeper than the applications of that mechanic available to other Pokemon. Terrabagos was where Terra Stylization came from, and Terra Starstorm was the expression of that origin's authority over what it had created. They deserved moves that fit them completely, not approximately, not adequately, but completely. The effort to achieve that completeness produced moves of great variety, from the devastatingly simple to the mechanically complex, from the emotionally warm to the cosmically cold. The variety was the evidence of genuine individual attention to each legendary's specific nature. They deserved moves that said something true about them. This was the harder criterion because it required the designers to understand each legendary well enough to know what truth to express. When they succeeded, the signature move felt like revelation. When the fit was less perfect, the move felt mechanical and arbitrary. The collection's best examples succeeded because the designers had genuinely engaged with what each creature was, and then built the move from that understanding outward. They deserved moves that lasted. Every signature move in this collection is still in the game, still accessible through the creatures that have always carried them. None of them were removed. None were reassigned to other Pokemon in the way that Sacred Sword was eventually extended beyond the Swords of Justice. The most personal moves remained personal. They are still there, in whatever form the game currently takes, belonging to the same creatures they were designed for. This permanence is not incidental. It reflects a commitment that the series has maintained across its entire history with signature moves, a commitment to the idea that the most specifically designed expression of a legendary's power belongs to that legendary and to no other. That commitment is itself a form of respect, an acknowledgement that what was designed for one creature was designed for that creature in particular and deserved to remain that way. The legendary Pokemon of every generation are still out there in the world of the games, still carrying their signature moves, still waiting in their various locations for the trainers who will eventually find them. Jiraki waits in its comet, Lugia waits beneath the waves, Arceus waits at the Hall of Origin, Zygarde waits in its incomplete fragments scattered across the region, Calyrex waits in its throne room in the Crown Tundra. Each of them is whole in its own way, complete with the moves that define them, ready for the moment of encounter. The moves are not simply stored in their bodies as data. They are, in whatever sense the fiction of the game world makes meaningful, part of what these creatures are. Doom Desire is not something Jirachi knows how to do. It is something Jirachi is, expressed in the specific context of battle. When you encounter a legendary, you encounter not just a Pokemon, but a move. The creature and its signature attack arrive together. And together, they say something specific about what the world of Pokemon contains, and what it values, and what it is willing to preserve across all the generations that have followed since the first designers asked what a legendary should feel like when it fights. The answer was not a single thing, but a collection of answers, one for each legendary. Each one precisely fitted to a creature that deserved exactness rather than approximation. The collection we have traveled through tonight is the record of all those answers, given with care across a long span of time, and now here in this quiet place, told once more to those who wish to listen. One more layer is worth adding to the picture before we truly close, a reflection on how the signature moves of legendary Pokemon relate to the moves of non-legendary Pokemon in ways that are sometimes more illuminating than the moves themselves. Every mechanic used in a legendary signature move has a cousin somewhere in the ordinary move pool. The delayed strike of Doom Desire appears in lesser form in Future Sight. The stat swapping of Heart Swap echoes elements of moves, like Guard Swap. The form-changing quality of Relic Song has distant relatives in moves that trigger weather or terrain. The guaranteed critical hit of Wicked Blow exists in the broader history of high critical rate moves. What the signature moves accomplished was not the invention of entirely new mechanics from nothing. It was the application of existing mechanical ideas to legendary creatures in ways that made those mechanics feel extraordinary rather than ordinary. Future Sight was a modest move used by various Pokemon. Doom Desire was the same fundamental concept, given a name that felt inevitable for Jiraki, attached to a creature whose entire existence was built around the idea of wishes and cosmic timing. The elevation of familiar mechanics through precise application to specific creatures was itself a design philosophy. The signature moves did not need to be unprecedented to feel special. They needed to be exactly right. When they were exactly right, the mechanics that had seemed unremarkable in other contexts became remarkable because of the creature expressing them. This is perhaps the deepest lesson the collection offers. Meaning does not live in mechanics alone. It lives in the meeting of mechanics with the specific character of the creature that uses them. A delayed strike was just a delayed strike until Jirachi made it a wish sent ahead of time to fulfill itself. Then, it was something else entirely. Something that could only ever belong to that creature, and that expressed what that creature was more precisely than any description could. The signature moves of legendary Pokemon are, in the end, small acts of love. Love for the creatures they were designed for, expressed through the particular discipline of game design, through the careful pairing of mechanic with character, through the long tradition of asking what a legendary deserved, and then answering that question as precisely as possible. The answers are all here. They have always been here. Tonight we simply took the time to hear them again. There is a particular stillness that comes at the end of a long journey through a world you love. The kind of stillness where facts and feelings have settled together into something quieter than either. Tonight we have moved through decades of design and dozens of creatures, from the wishing star asleep in its comet to the crystalline deity at the origin of a new mechanical era. We have spent time with the silver guardian of storms, the golden bird of resurrection, the temporal dragon who bends time with a single roar, the spatial dragon who tears the fabric of what is. We have sat with the moon's quiet counterpart to nightmares, the mechanical flower maiden who gives everything in a single cannon blast, the shadow thief that steals what others have built and uses it against them. We have visited the ancient colossus who dragged continents, the exile who fights from a dimension beyond ordinary access, the twin wolves of sword and shield, the cosmic parasite who has been leaking its power into a region for 50,000 years. We have spent time with the smallest and the largest, with Jirachi's patient delay and Eternatus's catastrophic beam, with Manaphy's gentle renewal and Kyurem's bone-deep cold, with Victini's explosive generosity and Calyrex's kingly completeness. Each one was different. Each one was exactly itself. The series earned these moves through attention, through the long practice of asking what each creature deserved and then working to deliver it rather than settle for something adequate. Some of the moves in the collection are more successful than others. Some feel more precisely fitted to their users, more resonant with the creature's full identity, more useful in expressing through mechanics what the lore described in words. But all of them were made with the same underlying intention. Every player who has played through a Pokemon game has had a moment with a legendary that felt different from encountering any ordinary Pokemon. The approach to the chamber, or the clearing, or the top of the tower, the music that signals something significant is about to happen. The creature that appears larger and more present than what came before it. These are designed moments, carefully constructed to communicate importance. What makes those moments work is not only the visual and audio design, though those elements carry real power. It is the knowledge, usually held somewhat unconsciously, that the creature in front of you is one of a kind. There is only one Lugia in any given game, only one Dialga, only one Rayquaza. The creature that appears in that chamber belongs to the world in a way that the multiple Pidgeys on the route outside did not. It has a specific identity. The signature move is the battle expression of that specific identity. When Lugia uses Aeroblast and no other Pokemon can, when Giratina uses Shadow Force and vanishes into a dimension that nothing else can access. When Xerneas uses Geomancy and its horns glow in 7 colors, while drawing the world's life energy into itself, the move reinforces what the encounter already began to communicate. This creature is unique. This creature has something that belongs to it and to no other. The world shaped something specific when it shaped this being, and here's the proof in the act that only it can perform. That proof is a form of recognition. It says that the designers saw the creature clearly enough to know what it needed and cared enough to provide it. The signature moves of legendary Pokemon are the series keeping a promise to each of its legendaries, the promise that they would be treated as what they were, as distinct and irreplaceable, and not simply as powerful Pokemon who happen to be harder to catch. The legendaries were always more than their stats. They were presences, characters in the broadest sense, creatures with histories and roles and qualities that resisted reduction to numbers. Their signature moves were the bridge between those qualities and the battle system, the translation of who they were into what they could do. That translation, performed carefully and consistently across so many creatures and so many years, is one of the quiet achievements of the Pokemon series. Not the loudest achievement, not the most celebrated, but real and worth the recognition of a slow and attentive hour. The signature moves will still be there in the morning, belonging to the same creatures they have always belonged to. And you will be rested, and the world will be ready, and the legendaries will be waiting in their places, carrying their specific powers, as they always have. The moves of legendary Pokemon also invite a kind of gratitude that is easy to overlook in the pace of playing. Every trainer who has caught and trained a legendary has spent time with that creature's signature move, even if they were not conscious of thinking about it in those terms. The move was simply there, doing what it was designed to do, expressing the creature that used it in the only way the battle system allowed. That quiet expression, available to anyone who played through those encounters, was a form of generosity from the designers to every player who ever stood in the right place at the right time and found something extraordinary waiting for them. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed drifting through these quiet moments, there's another video waiting on the left of your screen. Let it play while you rest. You might discover something gentle before sleep takes you again.